And welcome to the work session of our Provo Municipal Council meeting. And we are meeting in the City Center conference room. Today is October 29th, 2019, and it's 12:35. First of all, let's see. Well, let's have a roll call first. So,
Cliff Strachan.
Brian Jones.
Dave Knacht. George Handley.
Elizabeth Van Werken.
Kate Van Drunen.
Gary Witterton.
George Stewart.
Mayor Kafusi.
Isaac Axman.
Okay, thank you. We'll excuse Chair David Harding, who's out of town, and Dave Sewell for now, but he will be here. Is that correct? He's
Yes.
going to be late. Thank you. We've asked Robert Mills to give us an opening prayer.
Our kind Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity to gather this afternoon to discuss items pertaining to Provo City. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the moisture that we've received and it will continue to come to us. Father, we pray for thy Spirit to be with us this day. Especially bless our council members that we can discuss these items. And please we pray for all of those who work so hard to make Provo a wonderful place to be. Heavenly Father, we're grateful for our blessings and we pray humbly in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Robert. We also want to welcome others who are here. We appreciate you coming and taking time to help us make good decisions this week. First of all, I would like to approve some minutes. It's proposed that we approve the following minutes. August 27th, 2019 work meeting, September 10th, 2019 work meeting, and September 24th, 2019 work meeting. Are there any objections or requested changes to these minutes, council members? Okay, seeing no objections, we declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those seated at the council table may speak or ask questions, unless otherwise invited by the chair. Our first item of business is an ordinance amending Provo City Code regarding planning commission approval of reductions in required parking, including for multifamily residential uses. And Robert Mills, Provo City Planner, will make this presentation.
Thank you for having me back, council members. We have talked about this ordinance amendment proposal a couple times, but I just wanted to kind of bring you up to date on what the current proposal is and how we got there. So, as most of you know, in section 1437.050, currently we allow for some parking reductions for different types of uses. Currently, those uses allowed a parking reduction are commercial, industrial, or public facilities. The Housing Committee, the City Council Housing Committee suggested that we look into expanding that reduction to allow for multifamily residential uses to possibly receive this.
Isn't it true that at the bottom of the parking section, there's a section that currently allows multifamily housing if it is government kind of subsidized?
That is correct. So that in a different section of the code, another use that is allowed a parking reduction if a multifamily project receives basically government assistance as far as financing or anything like that, then they can receive a parking reduction as well.
Does that include tax increment financing?
I don't know, but my guess is that would be considered government support. Yes.
You know where that is, Robert?
1434 in the list of required parking.
Oh, okay.
So as staff, we put together some proposals of language that would address these, and went to the Planning Commission a couple times actually, and we have talked with them and gone through them with them, what our existing language says and what the proposed language is, and we've come to this sort of agreement that you see up here in Exhibit A. So specifically, we're changing the purpose and intent to allow multifamily residential uses to be included, and then specifically precluding batching single residential projects from receiving these types of reductions. Again, the purpose of this ordinance is not to create entitlement or to create a situation that every single project would automatically receive a reduction. This is just a tool that the Planning Commission can use based on the context of a project to analyze and determine whether a parking reduction would be warranted. And so we want to emphasize the fact that most likely a lot of projects will be requesting a parking reduction. That does not necessarily mean that a project would receive a parking reduction. That determination is made by the Planning Commission after they've reviewed all of the contextual elements and the analysis done by either a traffic engineer, a traffic planner, or something like that. Mr. Stewart.
So this is after we approve the project.
If there's a zone change or something like that that would need to happen, then obviously they would come to the city council.
Of course, not coming, they would have the authority to do it.
Through the project plan process. So, previously, this section of the code allowed for a couple different ways for those uses to receive a parking reduction. They would create what was called a parking count justification study. And then the initial proposal was to create a transportation demand management program that a residential project would submit and be reviewed, and then they could, the Planning Commission could decide whether that would justify a reduction. In reviewing this, we felt that it would be better to just create one system of receiving a parking reduction, that everybody, no matter what the use is, they would have to submit some sort of transportation demand management program of what elements that they would be implementing in order to justify a reduction, and then to also submit a parking count justification study that was done by some certified and applicable professional that could actually add validity to their transportation demand management program. And so that was, the Planning Commission felt that that was acceptable and a good way to go, because it would allow them to have the necessary justification that they would need in order to prove something like that. So if you'll, Bryce, if you'll scroll down to almost the last page, kind of explains what the TDM program would be required, and then I just want to highlight a couple things about this.
Here?
Yes. So there are a couple things that they could incorporate as a TDM program. One of which would be they could allow for extra space on their site to be incorporated as landscaping rather than parking, but they could save it. So if in the future, if additional parking was required, they would already have that space. It could be easily converted. That's not a requirement, but it seems like a good option for a TDM program. Lots of times, however, the space of a site might not accommodate something like that. So there's a multitude of other things that they can implement. We specifically wanted to pull out item G. In no case shall parking for residential uses be less than one space per unit for a one-bedroom unit or 1 1/2 spaces for a unit with 2 or more bedrooms. Again, this is just the ultimate floor. It doesn't necessarily have to go down to that point, but we wanted to create a space that an applicant could not go any lower and could not request a reduction lower than that.
Robert?
Yes.
Question on that G, where it says 1.5 spaces for a unit with 2 or more bedrooms. So if there are 3 bedrooms, they still need 1.5 units?
That's up to the planning commission. But that would be the ultimate minimum that they could go to. And then if you'll scroll down to item H, number 4, Bryce, the very last thing. This is at the request of Councilmember Harding, and we felt it was a good request for those projects that incorporate landscaping elements to kind of reserving space on their site. That if in the future, if they needed parking, they could convert it. Councilmember Harding suggested a sunset, that if after 5 years they've never needed additional stalls or anything like that, that it could be incorporated into, that they would no longer need to hold that specifically for parking. It could be incorporated as other types of amenity space on the project site. So. But this is kind of what the current proposal is and what you'll be seeing this evening. And I'm available for any questions. Yes, Mr. Hart.
Time is really tight in this meeting, so this is coming to the next meeting, so we can have discussion here or there. So.
Yeah, just one. I like what Dave suggested there on the sunset clause. If we go back to the very first paragraph.
Press King scroll up.
Very, very first.
Yeah.
The purpose and intent.
Yeah. So I don't remember the red line that says this section should not be used to reduce parking for batching singles.
So this was something that we noticed was not included. The intention of this ordinance was never to accommodate for batching singles to receive a parking reduction, and so that was added in there.
Okay. But it raises a question for me. If they actually produced a plan that justified a reduction, why would we not want to give it?
That's a really good question. Parking enforcement for batching singles projects seems to already be a concern. And
I know it's a sensitive subject, but you know, we've made mistakes in the past, Joaquin Village. We've hit the money sometimes. Other times we can require too much. So, you know, if they're on 8th North, you know, we've had projects proposed that close. And they can show that because of UVX and all these other things that they're not going to need the standard of I think they could convince somebody that was reasonable. But this would seem to preclude that. So,
and again, that's up to the council members if they would like to
So would
include that.
the abandoned night hall be excluded from this, for example?
So if it's batching singles, yes.
Yeah, I mean, but that's a good example of why we might want to keep it included, right?
well, or flexible.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Give them flexibility where necessary.
So yeah, removing the sentence would allow the flexibility. Including it automatically takes it out.
Yeah,
It's a great point.
Suggesting I'm inclined to remove that sentence.
Let's bring this up in tonight's meeting, and maybe a motion will be in order. We can get, obviously, a question.
It could override a development agreement, would it?
No. So the development agreement would be the specific zoning for that site, and we wouldn't allow it to be non-conforming as far as that. They have to be in compliance with each other.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks. Our next item is a resolution of Provo City Council authorizing the acceptance of the Utah State Infrastructure Bank Loan Fund for the airport. And Brian.
Yep, I'm going to make up some time for you. We can make this one really quick. So you will see this tonight in your regular meeting. We've talked about this loan previously. when we discussed the interdepartment loan from Energy for use on the airport. This is the other loan that we discussed at that time. The Transportation Commission, the State of Utah Transportation Commission approved our application for a $5 million loan at their September commission meeting. So in order for us to receive that loan, we need a resolution from council indicating such. So that's what the item is. Bryce, do we have the resolution? Essentially, so terms of the loan, 2.1% interest, 5-year repayment term, due upon, well, beginning at completion of the project. So our initial conversations with UDOT has been, and this may adjust some, which is also part of the resolution that you allow Mayor Kafusi to negotiate the terms of the repayment based on completion of the project. But initially, the thought has been completion of the project in fall of 21, first payment due, and it's an equal payment, 5-year repayment plan. First payment would be due in fall of 22, and to be paid off in fall of 27. Our thought is to have that paid off much quicker with future MAG funding. This is just to give us a shot in the arm because of the MAG funding today. We are awarded MAG funding. It's not available till 23-24. So this loan helps us bridge that gap in time. So, any questions?
Yeah, so if we don't get the money from MAG until 23 or 24, are we going to be looking for an appropriation in 21 from general fund, from capital improvement? Do you have any direct know where you see that coming from?
Right now, Gary, that's a good question. I think certainly yes. We're going to need to advance money somehow. We haven't really gotten that far down the road as to where that might come from. We met with MAG yesterday. The process is on project selection doesn't finalize until August of next year. So like I say, we're a little early, but this does allow us to get started on some of the dirt work that's required to get things settling out at the airport, the bottom muds that we have out there. So,
and I'm hoping that a lot of that funding will also become from this new revenues generated for the gates. You know, I just, and the leasing of terminals, leasing of hangars and things like that. I think this is huge for Provo, personally.
we have a lot of work to do, and certainly we probably need to come and give the council an update of where we are on funding at some point. I'll leave that up to Mayor Kafusi when the right time is for that. But we are also seeking additional funding from FAA. We have a similar time frame on knowing anything about those funds as late summer next year. So we do have funding in place to get us started on that dirt work, which as hopefully all of you have received invite to our groundbreaking next week. We are bidding those projects here quickly.
The other thing I've mentioned, we're not, it's kind of our last resort, but another option that we have is the new county quarter-cent transportation sales tax, and that's a potential too, but we're hoping that we don't need that, but it's there as a backstop as well.
Thanks for that, Joe. That is Plan B. If for whatever reason we don't get MAG funding, which seems highly unlikely, we do have that quarter-cent sales tax that would be available through those years to pay off this loan.
Any other questions for Brian? And this is on tonight's meeting.
This is on tonight's agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Item 3 has been continued, so we'll skip to
10 and 11.
Yeah. We'll skip 3 to 10. Discussion, item 10 is discussion regarding the sign ordinance committee's proposed text amendment to clarify sign size and requirements. So, Gary, you know.
Yeah, I'll start with Item number, let's see. Let me just-
10, I've got it on the page number, we moved 10 here. Okay. This one has, the first number 10 has to do with
clarifying the sign requirements. What we had in the sign requirements before was a graph that went, it arced and waved and went up and down a little bit. It was a little bit confusing, I think, for some people to read and understand. Is that right, Bryce? Isn't that what you're saying? So Bryce and Hannah got together, and John and Brian, and they actually created some numbers based on where that graph seemed to fluctuate, but gave us a little bit more clarity rather than up and down. And we divided up some size of signs based on frontage, based on square feet, and
There's a lot in the area of the wall.
yeah, square. And so with that, in your packets, does anyone have any questions? Have you had a chance to look at that and see where we are with those numbers? Brian, do you want to add something?
Well, I just clarify that none of this is intended to actually change anything about
Yes.
what the current size allowed is. It's just that we felt like there were some deficiencies in the way those current sizes were portrayed. One of our biggest concerns was that there was no text accompanying the graph that said at the end of the graph what the graph was cut off. So we were a little bit worried about somebody coming in and arguing that the line went forever and we just hadn't showed it. Right? So we thought that doing it this way with the table was more clear as to exactly what could be done.
And that was the purpose of this change. It's not to change anything from what we had, it's just to basically clarify that this is the standards that we have in place right now. And just to make it easier to understand.
We need a motion to send this to planning commission.
Thank you.
So we have a motion by George Hanley and a second by George Stewart. Move this forward, all in favor? Dave McCarty and Bruce Sewell, excuse.
Okay, do you want to read it?
Next, item 11 is a discussion regarding hold time for electronic signs. And Gary will go ahead and get this going too.
The purpose of this today is to not ask council members to bring it to a vote, but to give you the opportunity to look at some of the research that has been done, Brian, Bryce, and Hannah, with regard to some of the things, just discuss some of the things that we have found. Kay, help me with this, you're in on all those meetings with me. So, as we go through with this, Gary McGinn wanted to come and present to the council and talk about enforcement and the challenge that some of the hold times would represent to them in enforcement. Also, David Walter said he would like to come to the council and talk about impact on some redevelopment that he is working with. He was going to talk with the mall, he was going to talk with the shops at Riverwood, and get their input and feel around what a citywide regulation would do. And if we broke it down, Gary McGinn wanted to talk about the challenges with enforcement. So we look to have that coming back to the council in 2 weeks with those two people presenting. We wanted to talk about, just take a minute, does anyone have any questions on this that was put in our packets as far as hold times?
I'm just going to make a little comment too. There's a difference of opinion in the committee on our hold times. There's some pretty strong feelings to stay 1 minute or more and have less changing. And there's other side that says 8 seconds is fine. And we need to change so they get the benefit of having electronic sign. And that's why we want to come back to the council. So we're not coming to a consensus in the committee on which direction to go, so we thought we'd open it up a little further and get some feedback from the council members that would help drive that direction a little bit.
But I would throw out there too, and I think this was mentioned last time it came up, and correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, but I think there is consensus on the committee that the current 3 times a day standard should change. It's just, what we don't have consensus about is what it should change to.
Then it should change to something more frequent.
Yes, than 3 times.
And I'd like to give you a synopsis of some of the things that I've been hearing, and I'll try to be, I have a bias, but I'll try not to let that bias come in at this point. There are concerns in the neighborhood with regard to safety. It's changing, it doesn't become a distraction. And as you look at this, there was a memo that was sent out, and it said they have not been able to actually tie. This is really frustrating and confusing to me at times, because they say, yes, it is a distraction when it changes, but it is not enough of a distraction that we can pinpoint to actually say that it is causing accidents or problems.
So to me, the purpose of having a sign is to create a distraction.
No question.
To advertise. So if it changes more frequency, it's more distraction.
And they have not, and it is more distraction, and they admit to that. And they're saying that it is not necessarily a cause for, this is confusing, because distractions cause accidents, and this is not a distraction that they see, are able to tie to. It is, this one is particularly, it was a study that was done in Cincinnati, and it was done for the sign industry, if I remember right. No, I don't think so.
I think, Hannah, I think, is the one that did most of the research on this one, right? But I think if I could summarize a little bit, I think that and there's several studies that Hannah looked at. My understanding, again, I haven't read them all, Hannah was the one who did the research, but my understanding from her recap is that what most of the studies show is that signs do cause you to look away. That's their intent. But in essence, there's lots of things that cause you to look away that you encounter while you're driving, and that it's only when you look away for longer than a certain amount of time that it's linked to causing accidents, and that the studies don't find that signs cause you to look away for more than the amount of time that causes accidents. Does that make sense? Anyway, I'm not trying to support that or anything. I'm just saying that's what was reported to us that the studies say. Is that therefore, while it is causing people to look away from the road, it's not causing a safety problem, according to the studies.
Yeah, doesn't it depend on what's on the sign? If you have a video of a car accident happening on the sign, then even if it's only 3 seconds, people are going to go, wait, what was that? So.
For sure, that's one of the reasons behind
If
Provo's
they've done it independent of the
against
content
animation.
of the signs, then it doesn't seem like it's reliable research.
Well,
It doesn't really tell us a whole lot.
And I can't speak to that because I don't know whether they did take that into account or not. That is, what you just cited is why Provo has a prohibition against animated signs.
And one of the challenges we face in that is what's on the sign is that we are then, if we go over there, then we are stepping into content, and that becomes a legal challenge, a constitutional challenge. Are we trying to control content of the sign?
Well, I'm not, but I'm saying that because I can't control the content, I would rather control the frequency of the turning. Because if I'm not persuaded that this study tells us a whole lot, since it's independent of the content, and since we can't legislate the content, I'd rather be cautious rather than be liberally granting all kinds of frequency when I don't know whether or not it's going to be a safety issue when it could be.
Right.
If I were to work on the premise that it doesn't affect traffic accidents at all, and just go with what does it do to anyone who lives in close to that proximity where that side of night going on and off, changing intensity, changing messages, is going to disturb them as they try to sleep or enjoy life.
And that becomes another issue as far as buffer zones that we talked about as a committee.
Or frequencies. I mean, if someone has a sign within that buffer zone, then do we want to, at night, restrict how many times it changes versus the day?
And those are the discussions that we do expect.
And that would be presumably not just content, but color, right? So, I mean, if one sign is mostly white and it's very bright, and then the next sign is a soft blue or something like that, and you're living in that neighborhood, you may not notice the changing of the signs if they're all sort of uniform color, but if every third time it's a very bright image, then suddenly it becomes very distracting.
And those, and I understand that, and those become, we do have regulations about brightness already.
Well, yeah, but it's,
And color has to do with brightness.
yeah, so I think what he's saying is, even if it met the technical requirements of brightness, the fact that there's a relative perception of different intensity, and you're in your home, trying to go to sleep, whatever, and then it becomes that distraction, because it's not a continuous thing. It is fluctuating, and it's erratic enough that it's bothersome.
And well, I think that's, Bryce, I don't know if you want to scroll up to the next page. I think it's in here. I think one of the cities took that into account by Draper. We can't use what, you can't have a slide that's more than 50% white. That kind of issue is one of the impetuses behind that.
That's content.
That's not content. That's form.
Yeah, form.
So, if I may, Hannah has sent out basically a summary of the research we found regarding signs and how distracting they are, and whether there's evidence to say that they do cause accidents, which there's not sufficient data, just a summary. She sent out the effectiveness of signs and how effective they've been seen. And she sent out hold times and buffer, and that's what this one is, hold times and buffer zones, so that you can kind of get a sense for the research that we found as we discuss this decision. So those are three things that between now and the next meeting, when we talk about this a little bit further, it might behoove you to look at those and just kind of get
These are emails that she recently sent.
Yes.
So, we can look at what other people are doing, but in some respects, I think they're not necessarily brighter than we are. So, the reason I bring that up, you can look at 5 seconds, 3 seconds, 8 seconds. The original 8-second rule was designed for freeway applications, correct?
Yes. For billboards,
Billboards. And it was done because people are traveling at a certain speed and you want to be able to get your message across. And so the 8 seconds was relative to how fast you were going. Let's say you're going half that speed in town, maybe 16 seconds, to achieve the same result. I can't see why anyone would want or need.
Well, they may say 4 seconds.
No.
Because they're going slower, they'll have, oh, bang, I can do that. Oh, bang, I can do that.
If the purpose on the freeway was to get your message across, I would think that going slower, you could change it less often.
I just don't know what the reasoning was when they made 8 seconds. If that's what it was, maybe that there's some truth in that. I'm not sure how they arrived at the 8 seconds for freeway billboards.
But it was for freeway speeds. Yeah. So that's why I brought up the idea of speed and frequency.
The other topic of discussion that I've heard with, as we go through redevelopment and talk with Mall and Riverwoods, is that as they come into these areas, they don't think a lot about signage until they go to another city and say, we'd like you to come to our city. And then it's like recruiting a football player. You're not going to hear about it from us. If you are going to hear about it from them, they won't even let you put a sign up there. It is going to help their business. So it becomes part of the idea of recruiting businesses and supporting businesses in our community. And those there is some frustration, I've heard from businesses, say, I can't even advertise, and they blame their experience on not being able to have a sign. Now that's, I'm not sure that they can justify that blame, but they do. And so those are things that we get to talk about and need to consider as a council with regard to what we allow, how often we allow, type of signs.
That being said, I do want to be competitive with other communities. My biggest concern is light pollution into bleeding over into the residential areas and causing a nuisance at night.
So then would you be looking at more, wanting the committee to look more at the buffer zones rather than the change and the...
Buffer zones and maybe how often they change at night versus the daytime.
And we've had some different opinions. It's really interesting. As I go at 4:30 in the morning on Wednesday, I'll go up to the Riverwoods, and on the south side, that sign is off. On the north side, it's on. And it's interesting to see. And now the south side, I'm not sure if that's because they're concerned about the neighborhoods being more to the south, but there are places on the north, and there will be more places to the north as that development that's on University Avenue continues to be built. But one side is off and the other side is on. Those are things that we can look at. Some communities have said at 10 o'clock they have to put up a static sign, or at midnight they have to turn it off. Some communities have said they have to turn it off if they are not open. And then they say, well, I lose my opportunity to advertise. So we need to look at those buffer zones, and if you have any input, we'd be interested. But you're going to get the opportunity here from David Walters and Gary McGee with regard to enforcement and what they're experiencing with people as they work with people, trying to get them to come to Provo.
I think it would be helpful to the committee if we had some feedback about turning. I mean, do you favor longer or shorter? Where do you fall in that area?
Personally, I'm not really worried about keeping up with other cities on this. I don't feel like, I mean, I'm sorry that I didn't read over Hannah's research previously. I'm looking at her summary right now. I mean, I raised the question about whether or not signs were an effective strategy.
Can I address that?
Given what smartphones can do, and I think what worries me is that it feels like the proverbial slippery slope. I mean, and maybe we're already on it, and we feel like we can't stop, but once you start competing in this way, and you sort of make this the way in which businesses communicate to citizens in our city, then of course everyone's going to feel a competitive disadvantage whenever some restrictions are placed. And then they're going to start citing what other cities are going to allow them to do. So then you say, well, okay, we're gonna open up the floodgates, and then you have the problem of light pollution, distraction, and a quality of life that I don't think is desirable. So I think I would prefer to take this very conservatively and to not feel, I just don't want to feel like that this is the one thing we can do to make more businesses want to come to Provo. We want to have more businesses come to Provo, but I don't think this is the point where we want to sort of use as our front driving wedge on that issue. I think there are other ways to bring them here without necessarily opening the floodgates on more and more frequency of churning.
And I agree with that, and I know that since I've been on the council, we've addressed this twice. Now this is the third time. And I think it is an evolving issue that we are going to again address probably in 4 more years as technology changes and becomes less, not as expensive. Some of these signs are very, very expensive, and they're coming down in price. And I think that there's going to be opportunities to address it again. So I think, as a council, I think we need to look at where we are today and where we hope to be in the future, but I don't see that, I see a lot of change still coming within the next 5 years.
Okay, real short then, George. So our quality of life is, of our residents, I think, is of primary importance. Using this as a tool to attract business, or on the other hand, if we're so out of sync with everyone else that it actually repels business. For example, if we didn't allow electronic signs at all, that would have a telling effect.
And that's where we were 4 years ago. All you could do is back up. We saw that was the electronic sign. Go away.
On balance, I'm okay with an 8-second turn rate. Just, as I've studied it, I feel comfortable with that. It's a state standard. I don't think it's excessive. I don't think it's been shown to be enough of a negative to change what's been done otherwise statewide. So I think I'm okay with an 8-second turn rate. Whether that makes a difference or not, I don't know, but I'll be in my position.
George, day and night?
Yeah. Do you need to look at maybe what time of night, whether they need to go on all night? Those are other issues. If I was a businessman, I wanted to have it after 10 o'clock at night, I don't think I would care. Certainly after midnight, I wouldn't care. I don't know why you'd want to keep them on all night, but there's so little traffic. That's an unbalanced thing. Unbalanced, if you're going to have an 8-second turn rate, should you control the timing of that? I think it'd be reasonable to control the timing.
Any other feedback for the committee? I appreciate everything that's been expressed, and we'll talk about it again in the committee. Economic development, or over. Do you have any other input for us?
I would just hate to see the sign ordinance be that thing that would repel businesses. Again, who knows what compels a business to be in a community? It's usually the bottom line. And that can be done by a lot of different ways. Proximity to, again, vehicle trips per day, location. There's a lot of factors. I think signage is one of them. And it's just taken as a whole, whether it be our fees, our impact fees, our, all those things, our ordinances, all those things taken as a whole start making a difference to a business. And we don't want to be the highest and we don't want to be the lowest. We want to be just kind of that just right. I know that's hard to find just right sometimes. And I think you just want to be cautionary and purposeful and not just willy-nilly. And, you don't have to give it all away, but you don't have to be overly restrictive and just try to find balance, really. And then, are there areas where there aren't any residential within an area and where we're mixing our zones more? That's going to become even more and more of an issue because we have residential and yet, we don't want that residential to prohibit what's happening in the commercial zones and vice versa. It's hard to find a balance, and that's why you 7 elected people plus the mayor get to make those hard decisions and hopefully with good input on both sides of that issue. And so yeah, I guess, kind of moderation, I guess, not to go too extreme on any of those issues, because you don't want to be known as the city that you can't get a sign or do business, yet you also don't want to be the city that gives everything away and it looks like Times Square or Las Vegas. You don't want that extreme either, right?
I feel like my sense is that if this is a deal breaker for a business, and then maybe this sounds harsh, maybe they're not very good business people. Because if they think this is going to be the difference between being successful or not, it seems to me they're ignoring all the other incentives that we may be able to offer them. It seems to me they're ignoring all the ways in which they can advertise their business that isn't an annoyance to the public. And I would prefer to let them go do business someplace else.
Yeah, and again, it's whatever you do, it should be a conscious decision and eyes wide open that you know that you may be ostracizing some and welcoming others.
When I make a decision, I try to make it fair and reasonable. And so in this instance, I'm just looking personally at what's fair and what's reasonable. I think the 8-second turn rate is reasonable, given the study and all that's been done. But again, I think it would also be reasonable to look at timing and certainly where it's located.
Real quick, we talked about buffer zones, but as we incorporate more people living into business areas and mixed use, I think we need a policy that's just going to work everywhere. There won't really be a buffer at the end.
And like we've been told, our biggest offenders are actually the school boards that are in the neighborhoods. So,
And I would just add one other thought, and that is that overall, every sign that's added in Provo adds to our overall light pollution, period. So even if it's not my neighborhood where a sign is glaring into my bedroom, you know, the overall feeling of the city is affected by a sort of spreading of electrical signs, and I think if we don't figure out a way to limit that, I think it's just inevitably going to get worse. So that's where my
and I appreciate
feeling of
that.
caution is coming from. I just feel like this, I hate to overuse the slippery slope argument because I think that can be a bad argument in a lot of cases, but this does feel to me like you seed ground and then you got to seed more ground and then you got to seed more ground. You just don't see it adding up to a positive for the city.
I'm going to give you an anecdotal situation. As we go down, as we're considering that development on State Street, for a new medical plaza, the police came in and said, we need more light in this area. We're having a lot of darkness in this area. And the neighbor said, yes, I appreciate that. We need this light to help us feel safe. Then the next item, this was when the police came. The next item was very interesting to me because we talked about the medical plaza, and I don't want lights in my neighborhood. I don't want the pollution in my neighborhood, light pollution. And so I think that there's always going to be some trade-off. Light promotes safety and light pollution, if you call it that. And so I'm just wondering where things will actually balance out. And I appreciate what George said. It's trying to come to a reasonable and workable solution.
One thing to consider, I think it's easy to continue talking. We're talking in circles a lot of times on this issue. And I think really what the committee would like is some guidance from the broader committee. And so it might be helpful for someone to propose something and then determine if that's what you collectively want to do. And of course, the other option is to do nothing. But if you do nothing, then there may not be any point in pursuing the committee's work anymore. It's just one of those questions you have to decide.
I would propose we develop one standard, no buffers, and that it consider some difference at night, 10 o'clock, midnight, that it either stops changing or they turn it off. Of course, that can be their choice. And if you just turn it off, you save electricity, and you don't have the light pollution, but you have to balance that, like you said, with, is that light augmented by other lights so that you don't turn it off and have a dark area that's unsafe.
We will consider that as a committee. Any other things that you'd like us to consider, and we're going to come back to you very shortly with recommendations from the committee. It may be a split decision, and we'll let you know that as a committee.
So high turn versus low turn. You know, right now it's 8 seconds and then 3 times a day. If you wanted to reconcile that, I mean, you don't necessarily want one standard that it's all 8 seconds. That may be too drastic, but you know, if you have a second standard, 3 times a day seems, you know, like once a millennia. It just doesn't seem very effective for the businessman. So something that's not as distracting, and at nighttime, you know, it's, if we have this other standard, it won't be such an issue. But the low turn, I think that's something to talk about. You know, is it 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Yeah, that became a little bit of an issue for enforcement. in certain areas, it was this one grandfathered, it became a challenge. And so that was one thing that Gary McGinn would come and talk to us about. Thank you, though. I think that's great. We'll consider that.
Is there, let me ask the question, because he proposed it, is there a preference? I mean, we've got 5 of the council members here, and of course Dave and Dave aren't here, but is there a kind of a majority opinion on that? Do you want to have 2 standards, 1 standard? Because I think if you come to that, if you can get to that sense, then when you go back to the committee and you come back with the proposals, you already have a sense of whether we're supporting, the council supporting 1 standard or 2 standard. Save yourself some time is what I'm thinking.
And I appreciate that, but I'm not ready to make that decision without Gary McGinn's input on enforcement, because we can make whatever we want to do, but if we can't enforce it, I think it becomes a problem.
Well, I don't want to take more time if we need to move on. But yeah, one of the complications that the committee has struggled with about this is, I think everybody in the committee likes the idea of there only being 1 standard, but there's a difference in opinion about what that standard should be, and there's legal complications about which one you pick, right? So if you pick 1 standard, the 1 standard is 8 seconds everywhere in the city, and there's no low churn, high churn, then you're fine. But if you try to go to 1 standard in the city and the 1 standard is a minute, everybody that has a sign up right now that's in the 8-second zone is probably grandfathered. So that's where Gary then has enforcement concerns about, if we change the standard everywhere to a minute, but I've got all these businesses that are entitled to be 8 seconds, how do I have my enforcement people trained to figure out which one is which, right? So stabbing Cliff in the back about his proposal, to some extent, your decision about whether you want 1 or 2 standards might be influenced by your decision about what you think the standard should be.
We want the Harding's comments on the road too.
You want to rate them, Dave?
Okay, I'll just read this real quick. He says, I believe that I still don't understand this proposal. I may be missing something important. I apologize if my comments aren't helpful due to this possible misunderstanding. The proposal seems to me like a major departure from the sign corridor work that councilors Winterton and Van Kuren did before I joined. It also seems like a major departure from Councilor Sewell's argument that non-turning electronic signs are no more obtrusive than backlit signs that should be allowed anywhere backlit signs are allowed. I was totally convinced by that argument and supported that change. But by the same logic, I feel the electronic signs with appreciable churn are more obtrusive than backlit signs and still need to be convinced. And I still need to be convinced that they should be allowed everywhere the backlit signs work. I consider a once a day change to be no appreciable churn. I definitely think that changes every 8 seconds is appreciable churn. I feel that changes 3 times a day is generous enough amount for a sign to be treated like a traditional backlit sign.
Enough for that. It's just generous enough.
For a sign to be treated, sign being treated like a traditional backlit sign.
Okay, we still have work and confusion to go through.
Good question. In all your research, maybe I missed it. Here we have standards. Was there a consensus in other communities about what low churn would be?
No, that's something we completely made up. We're the only low churn community that I know of. Everybody else just goes with 8 seconds or something lower. I don't know that we've ever, or prohibits them entirely. But I don't know that, I'm pretty sure, isn't that right, Bryce? But I don't think Hannah found anywhere that was higher than 8 seconds.
No words faster than that.
Keep Provo unique.
And that's,
Keep us weird.
I appreciate your opinion, George, because that's kind of where we're going. I mean, we've got these whole forces going on. We've got to know. All right, thank you. We'll go ahead to our next item. Thanks, Gary. This is a discussion regarding the policy for the allocation of sewer connections for development west of I-15. Cliff, are you going to do the presentation?
Yeah, I'm going to introduce that. I just need the, So in recent prior meetings, the council asked that we set up kind of a working group within the city and identify, talk about the sewer connections on the west side and those issues, and identify, propose a policy to you on how to allocate those going forward. And we'll pull this up for reference, but ultimately, Bryce, what I'm going to need is the presentation slides. So.
Okay, you want the slides first?
Oh, the slides first, yeah. So we're just setting this up in case we need to go and look at any particular areas here. Once the slide's up, you'll see that we've got some questions, and considerations you to factor in. But so myself, Bill Pepperoni, Dave Decker, Brian Jones, and Elizabeth and I, Vanderwerken and I, met a couple occasions and then had some side conversations about what this policy, some of the issues around it. So we identified that one of the questions, is this really a citywide issue or is it only a west side issue? How many sewer connections are available or can become available? What are some of the constraints to allowing sewer connections? Is this policy consistent with west side development policies? What should determine who gets available sewer connections? What obligations currently exist? What other obligations and considerations will arise? Or what will we recommend to the council by way of policy? So these are some of the questions that we intend to answer today. You'll recall that in previous discussions, Mr. Decker outlined for you some of the issues around capacity. One of the first items that we come to realize is there really isn't a capacity issue on the east side, and so they won't be affected by any allocating that might come out of a policy. What you're really constrained by is existing pipes in the ground throughout this area, and ultimately a 36-inch pipe that we plan on in 2025 to parallel, okay, or twin. And so really the issue is how do we deal with all these other properties in the red and to some extent in the orange areas. These are the projects that you were shown previously. Okay, so the first question, is it a west side issue or a citywide issue? And we really come to the direction we've got from engineering is that it's really a west side issue. And so we'll go along in that regard. The question of how many sewer connections are available, it's a function of the capacity at the choke point, which is the pipe under the I-15. Public Works has been working on their I&I issues. They've been modeling the system to improve capacity, and they estimate there's roughly 500 to 600 connections available, subject to projects in process. The third item is, what are the constraints to allowing sewer connection? And ultimately, what was identified is that 36-inch pipe is the ultimate chokehold for any connections. And then what should determine who gets available sewer connections? We determined that the direct connection to the system flowing through the existing 36-inch pipe under I-15 is the key factor, and then secondarily is the appropriate zoning in place. And we'll show that a chart to you in a minute. Is the proposed policy, and we asked our question as we talked about the policy that we will propose to you, is it consistent with West Side development policies? And if you go to the West Side development policy that was adopted back in 2017, items 3 and 6 really apply, and I put the summary of what they are here, but basically it says, under encourage sustainable residential development patterns, establish ordinances to create a mix of housing type, lot sizes, and designs to accommodate various stages of life. It also then says detached single-family homes should be the predominant housing type, and use of other types should augment and not detract from the single-family feel of the area. Skip down a couple items in there. The overall density of the area should average 4 units to the acre. So those are factors under number 3.
And Cliff, and I appreciate that those are under number 3. I went to the airport board meeting and talked and introduced some of these questions about the sewer system and how it's going to work. And Steve just looked at me and said, "Gary, you're killing me." He says, "Do you really think that we need more?" And he said, "Please help us protect that airport area." And he said, put residential in that area. So I think that zoning does have a lot to do with that.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's talking about in this area putting any residential in here. The West Side Plan talks about all these yellow areas are where various types of housing would be.
And
But the airport protection area, not impacted by residential development.
at the airport, just so long as we're aware that the airport does have an effect on residential, and we got to be careful if we're going to put residential in the airport zone, close to the airport. And I can see that green there up there, is that higher?
Up here?
Yep.
That's agriculture. It's just the yellow.
It's just the yellow that we're talking about. Okay.
Okay.
Nothing planned.
So number 6 is require proper integration and sequencing of development. And so the policies that were adopted 2 years ago say that the full block should be considered when rezoning away from agricultural uses. Conceptual integrated development plan for the entire block should be required for zone change applications. And then discourage rezoning of land that is surrounded by agriculture zoning. And then development may be limited or deferred depending on the availability of adequate municipal infrastructure, including sewer, okay? Now, the issue there is, I remember when we were having that committee that the issue was, we called it leapfrogging. The idea was not to have projects leapfrogging the agriculture and creating these issues of having to have extensions beyond what already exists. And so that's factored into the various parts of how we thought about this project. The other thing was a recognition that when you have to consider not just a block that might be within a neighborhood, but kind of the broader concept of what that area is going to look like between the major streets. So what obligations currently exist? We've identified a number of projects, including Ivory Homes, Broadview Shores, John Jensen's project on Geneva Road, and some other projects. There's some projects that are in the pipeline, if you will, that have not been yet rezoned, but will be coming forward at some point. And this is just a partial list, and you'll see later on that we've provided a little bit better list and some of the thinking on it. What we don't want to do in this discussion today is get down in the weeds too low. We want to keep it kind of high level and just talk about the policy, not the specific number of available connections, because I think we've talked about that extensively. What other obligations or considerations will arise? Well, we know there's a school bond in progress, and by the time we get through, by the time we come back to the next meeting, we should have an idea whether that bond is passing or not, and definitely by the 19th. When we have the Board of Canvassers, we'll know what that number looks like. And then one of the questions that really still is out there is, nothing prevents, the council twice now has indicated a preference for keeping the 7-year pay-as-you-go plan that you've been working on. But nothing prevents you from considering proposals that might come to accelerate. Doesn't mean you have to accept them, but you also can't stop people from trying to come up with solutions and bring them to you. So what will we recommend to the council by way of policy? And these are some considerations we really want you to consider. When I show you the flow chart and we go through it, think about whether we've correctly prioritized the questions on the flow chart. Ask yourself, if the school bond does pass, should it be prioritized over other connections? How does the council want to allocate whatever's left? Should there be a time limit on development? And how and when can a developer move to a subsequent phase or allocation? And then how to ensure applicants don't circumvent our policies? And we'll kind of explain those a little bit further as we go. So what we came up with was an allocation flow chart. And based on the idea that if you can't get the sewage to the 36-inch pipe, it's not going to get processed. So the first element is, do they have direct access to the existing 36-inch pipe? If yes, then we go and talk about the zoning. If they have adequate zoning, yes, then the developer will be permitted to submit building permit applications. And if there's sufficient connections available for the request, then yes, a building permit issued and connections allocated. One of the things we talked about was not getting ahead of ourselves, issuing building permits, and then finding ourselves 2 years down the road with houses built for which we can't give occupancy. And so the feeling was that stopping it at zoning and at building permits was the place to properly control the flow of connections, if you will. So what happens if they don't have direct access to the existing 36-inch line? Then there's another, the question does, do they have indirect access that will be resolved prior to building construction? And if the answer is yes, because say the future lift station is going to come online within the year it takes to start, build these homes, then they can proceed to the issue of zoning.
So indirect access doesn't resolve the 36-inch bottleneck.
No, but it doesn't. But what happens is, let's say there out of 500 connections, there's 100 left, and we've allocated everything to the people that go through this easy element, right? Then the question is, if there's other projects aren't ready, is there a project ready that would be ready to go if just a year from now, say one of these projects here, say this project goes in, right? That'll improve, as I understand it, that'll increase our capacity, even though we're still limited at the 36.
So to be clear, Dave, this chart only applies to what the 36 will allow. Okay, so this chart doesn't really, one way of thinking about it is this chart's irrelevant to the 36 bottleneck, because if the 36 bottleneck doesn't allow it, then you don't even look at the chart, the answer is just no.
Right.
This is for how to allocate what the 36 allows.
Okay.
Right.
So if we used up or gave connections to everyone that was directly able to use the current sewer, and we still had some left over, and then it's like, oh, well, gee, how can we then do timing and sequencing to make sure that the next guy actually has sewer when he's ready?
That will be, so once a policy is established on how this is governed, then ultimately it falls to development services and engineering, basically, to determine that timing, whether it fits.
So what I don't see in here is somebody saying, oh, I'll pay for $3 million worth of a lift station so that I can get in line with the guys who already.
Let me come to that. Remind me that when I talk about how we'll come back to that. Okay. So then the other question is, let's say they don't have direct access. The question has come up is whether or not there is existing development or commitments, such as development agreement. We are aware that the Halliday project believes that it has a commitment from Merrill Bingham to provide services. The city's legal position on it is that we don't believe any such commitments exist. But there is a desire. From I know the mayor has expressed some sympathy to try and find a solution to that. So these are some of the things that fall outside the normal process. And is there a way to accommodate that will satisfy the various the city and the developers?
Can I make a comment about that?
Yep.
So the purpose of putting that on the flow chart, I think, is twofold. It's one, the purpose of even asking the question is to say, are there connections that need to be subtracted from the availability? So before you even go through the rest of the flow chart, right? And then the second purpose of putting it on there is to signal that right now the city's position is that there aren't. But as Cliff mentioned, we know that there are a couple parties out there that are asserting that there are. And I guess, being the lawyer in the room, what I'm trying to say is that's not the that shouldn't be construed as representing the final decision, right? That if those parties who have those beliefs are, welcome to make their case, and at some point on the analysis of that may change. But as of today, the position is that there's no binding legal commitment that requires allocations to be set aside before we review the rest of it. Does that make sense?
Quick question. So if obviously we have a couple people that claim that they have commitments, are they close enough that we can accommodate them Or are they far enough away that we would actually have to build infrastructure to accommodate them?
I think in both cases, the answer is yes. Right, there's some that probably could be accommodated, and there's some that will not be able to be accommodated without something significant happening like that main lift station at the bottom end of the city, okay? So we go.
This is a technical question about the flow chart. Shouldn't there be a yes option for that second question?
Well, we talked about it and we decided not to put any yes because we believe that there is no yes currently, right? So it was intended as a signal. It was intended as a signal that to the members of the public that at this moment there is no yes answer. If you gotta come convince us to put a yes answer on the chart.
Right. And if in reality is if there wasn't a yes answer that could be constructed out of it, we'd be putting them back into this box. And then again, so the answer to this one, if you don't have the 36, but you think within 2 years you might, if that access isn't really going to be available, the answer is no. When you get to develop zone for development, if the answer is they're not properly zoned yet, then the question will really be, is the rezone appropriate? If the rezone is appropriate, they go back to yes and hopefully move them through. If it's no, all no's end up going back here, desired connections remain unallocated, right? And of course, if we run out of connections, we can't allocate anything. So we'll come back in a minute to issues of policy considerations, but let me start throwing you the questions on there. In your opinion, have we correctly prioritized the questions in the flow chart? And then come to policy considerations. So when you talk about zoning, some of the policy considerations you might consider in the zoning is, what is the use? We already mentioned there's a question of whether the school should get priority. The West Side policy, for example, suggests that single-family dwellings are the preferred form of housing out there, with the others being kind of supplemental to those. What about the question of phased development? It's possible with some of the bigger projects that an applicant could come in and basically take most or all of the remaining connections that are available. And do you want to do that? And then the question is, we still have to decide on this issue of indirect access. If something comes along and somebody has a solution, can engineering and planning department determine that that's an appropriate fix to a problem? George?
Well, I guess I'm not a flow chart expert, so I'm a little confused about this. The policy considerations seem to me to be very high priorities, and yet since they're not in the flow chart, I'm not sure at what point I can say, well, you're currently zoned for development, but we don't think this development is appropriate for our plan.
Right.
Because it's too, you've got one house on a 5-acre lot, and that's just not going to work for us, but it's zoned appropriately. So is there, do we need to add a bubble that just says?
I made him take it out.
Okay.
And what
I'm getting all kinds of answers to my flow chart questions today.
I'm being somewhat facetious about that, but at one point when we were kind of constructing the flow chart, we had that as a decision point, and we moved it around several times. Here's the problem: if they are zoned, then they're entitled to build. Right? If they're zoned and they submit plans that comply with the code, then on what basis would we deny them a building permit? I don't know that we have any legal basis for denying. Now, I guess I'm skipping the step of if you want to put the policy considerations into code somehow, right? One of the conversations we had this morning is 15.03.100 of our code requires a review to determine if we have adequate facilities before, as part of reviewing somebody's design and issuing permits and stuff, right? If you want to go in and add, not as a mere kind of policy intent statement, but as actual code, that in certain geographic areas, part of the adequate facilities review is going to be a review of something. That's the question, right? Is that at that point, you have to actually put into the code what the criteria are for deciding whether somebody who already has the zoning can go forward or not. Now, the other thing is, this was one of the things we discussed quite a bit in this meeting, is that there's not very much zoning that already exists. Ivory Homes is already zoned, but doesn't have the direct access.
Bring up that map
Right.
now.
And there's an area, there's another area in the middle of the, kind of in the middle of the map that is already zoned. But-
Okay, we'll show you that right now.
But by and large, the vast majority
Would have to have
would have to
rezoned.
have rezones.
And that would just immediately kick us into the policy consideration.
Right, and so those were listed to the side because that's where the council gets to weigh in and actually look at those policy considerations in deciding whether to do the rezone or not.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, the flow chart was throwing me off, actually. Yeah.
So if you look at the map right now, there's a whole lot of agricultural land that some of these developers have options on or may own or whatever, and, you know, will they be redeveloped? There's already a section in here that's mostly undeveloped, and it's zoned, right? So those could conceivably move forward. We know the school, I think the school is supposed to go in here somewhere, I think roughly on that spot there, if the bond passes. One of the things, we'll come to it in a little bit, but when we start looking at the numbers, because this is correct, Dave, right? That in the 500 to 600 connections available, the model already excludes Broadview Shores, right? And their issue still is only going to be, can they connect into the existing lines in a sufficient way? Ultimately, when we talked about that other, let's switch back now to the other thing, Bryce. When we talked before about, we showed this map here, when this force main goes in and this southwest lift station goes in, that's going to improve a lot, and it's going to allow the capacity for Broadview Shores will be in there without affecting what's already modeled in the 36, is what I understood, okay? So if this goes in, that solves some problems for the Broadview Shores projects, okay? There's a project over on Geneva Road that, I can't remember exactly where in here, about 1800 South Geneva Road. That project, as long as it can connect into Geneva Road, could be connected, right? So there's some other issues. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on those, but let me scroll through here. All right. One of the questions we had is, should there be a time limit on development? Or in other words, how and when can the developer move to a subsequent phase? Because one of the things we're going to suggest is that you allow phasing of maybe 40 units on a project per year in order to allow the projects to move forward, but somebody doesn't take control of all that's left, okay? The other question then is how to ensure the applicants don't circumvent our policies. And the thinking there is if you have a project area that's really large, let's say there's 150 acres that somebody's got and they want to develop that whole thing as one project, we don't want to allow them to subdivide, form 5 other LLCs and suddenly be asking for all of their property, all of their allocations at one time and grab onto those. So when we talk about time limits, we figure that I think there's already in the code a limit of about 18 months for projects to move forward. The thinking is that by allowing some kind of time limit on there, then as a project, if somebody is allocated, say, 40 units and they don't move on those, at the end of that 18 months, they could forfeit their allocation. It goes back into the pool. Now, realistically, 5 years out, 3 to 5 years out, we're probably only 2 to 3 phases before we've solved all our problems in 2025 anyway. Okay? So we'll come to that. So here's our policy recommendations. The first one is for the council to adopt a written policy statement to outline the process and to add it to code. The second is to give priority to applicants with direct access to the existing 36-inch pipe under I-15 and with appropriate zoning. And how we build that language, we're not sure, but the flow chart is, this is based on the flow chart. 3, applicants with indirect access that will be resolved before building permits can be issued may submit rezoning applications. Similarly, we didn't state it that way. Similar, if they already have the right zoning, but they don't quite have indirect access. I don't know if there's any in that situation, but if there were, they technically could move on as well once that question of the indirect access is resolved. So then the question becomes, should the school district bond pass, the city should allocate all the needed connections to the proposed school road relocation. And a conversation I had this morning with Gary and Dave, it seemed to be that if we just reduce if we just said instead of having 500 to 600 connections, we just dropped that to number, we could accommodate the school anyway. One thing I will say about these allocations, the capacity that they're modeling, really one of the reasons why phasing actually is a good idea and a timeline on it is they're building connections based on, or their connection numbers are based on modeling and some recent changes. They really would feel more comfortable a year from now having that much more information on how accurate their modeling is. So then the next item would be to proposed development projects over 40 units should be phased to allow multiple projects to move forward. Subsequent phases may not be commenced until 50% of units in the prior phase are completed and occupancy permits issued. A reasonable time limit should be required for projects to reach 50% or the allocation can be revoked. And I think the time that was in the code is about 18 months, so we'll check into that. Rather than create this kind of a secondary or black market in sewer connections, we would require that they can't be transferred between developments. And then number 7 would be to prevent circumvention of recommendation number 5. Development projects will be based on the property size and the boundaries as of this date, the date of adoption. So they can't form other LLCs or subdivide them or whatever in a way to do that. Applicants may not subdivide or reincorporate or some other means to create multiple projects to get under the phasing requirement. That's the thinking. Number 8, development services would track projects in the development pipeline by phase. Engineering will project the number of available connections, and the two will regularly reconcile and report to the council on the number of unallocated sewer connections. That way we've got an idea of what's happening. This is just some numbers we came up this week, giving you an idea of how many projects, what projects are and what some of the numbers are, and the connections potentially needed. Still another 150 available after stuff that I think that's already in the pipeline. Or
Do we know what the school would be the equivalent of?
Right there.
about 100.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
The question also came up, for example, on the future soccer fields. And Scott Henderson indicated that probably only would require about 4 equivalent residential units of sewer, so that's not a big number.
Really? The water, all that? Well, I guess
Well,
that's
at least the initial phases, right?
Yeah.
So we don't want to get bogged down into this, but what I will tell you is that some of these numbers that might be larger, right, say this one. If this one was to develop and you had the phase approach, they might only be able to put 40 of them in the initial phase, or some number around that, right? Those are the kinds of issues, but that'll also then really, over time, allow that number to be spread broader across the city. So this is just a quick and dirty look at what the projects look like now. So what are the next steps? What we propose is to come back to you on November 12th with a written policy statement. If you support all this and direct us to, we come back on November 12th with a draft written policy statement and propose changes to code to govern the process. We'd also start the process of taking Title 15 changes to the Planning Commission, and we think that we can do that as early as November 13th. And if we get past these two, And if we get past these two stages, then what we hope to have is the final proposed policy statement and the code changes to you for adoption at the November 19th meeting.
So with regard to the middle school, I mean,
First of all, I just want to say, I think, you know, if the public will is that they want the bond, I think we have to accommodate that move. I'm not clear in my own mind about the timing of that, because they've talked about needing to spend their money within 3 years, and I don't know if Dixon is far enough down their list of priorities that they wouldn't be spending that money until, you know, 2.5 years out or something like that. And maybe that doesn't mean we have to make too many dramatic changes, but I think, and obviously by the November 19th deadline, you're saying we would know one way or the other. I guess I'm just expressing my support for the idea that we would make those accommodations if it passes.
Right, and so you'll know by then that becomes a priority. We just take that number right out of the available, right?
Right.
And if something happens, they decide they're not going to build, or these other projects get done earlier, the whole idea of having engineering and development services tracking what's available, what they think is available, and what's in the pipeline will help them decide how much can be done. One of the reasons we thought about splitting it into phases was to allow the different projects to move forward if the companies, the developers want to do that. But it also leaves units available for the mom and pop who has 5 acres and wants to subdivide into 2 or 3 units, right? It doesn't allow any one developer to control all of the available connections for the next 3 to 5 years.
So a related question is, I'm not really clear in my mind what other kinds of infrastructure implications there are precisely, like for different projects. So for example, with the school, you know, we've got the sewage, but then there are questions about roads, and presumably these other developments would have similar kinds of implications.
Yes, and if you remember the item 6 of the West Side policy, it very clearly states in there, the last item in section 6D says, development may be limited or deferred depending on the availability of adequate municipal infrastructure, such as sewer, storm drainage, water, etc. So meaning all the infrastructure. And so we just think this is a good phased approach. You've asked the question of how to allocate it. We think this is a way that is fair to developers. It's fair to people who may not be quite ready to develop. It doesn't reward those who've tied up all the land, but it does allow projects to move forward. It does allow time for these other projects, some of the infrastructure projects to start moving forward and maybe help resolve some of the issues that we've got. But ultimately, everything comes back to that 36. Until that parallel is built, there will not be sufficient capacity to build out the whole west side. And so I think, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what we're looking for is, if you support this, we'd like a motion from the council directing us to move forward with the next steps as we've outlined them, and we would bring them back to you. And so just to be clear, if we go back here, if you accept all these things, this is what we're going to draft up. If you have real policy problems with any of these, let us know. And now would be better. Later is still possible, but this is the fullness of what we're proposing to you.
Another question, in some of the developments that we're looking at, I know that often projects become profitable at the end of the project. Is 40 sufficient to allow, and if it's not, then it's their choice, I guess. Is that what you're telling us? It's their choice. If they can't do it with 40 units, don't do it.
And that's a good question. My understanding, for example, that Ivory builds about 50 in a year, right? That they're just moving forward with a small segment, even though they've got hundreds of, in their master plan. They are only building so many at a time. So maybe that number needs to be 50, maybe that number needs to be 40. We picked out that number because in our discussions, we just talked about 20 to 40, and so we picked the upper number. If, between now and, say, the 12th, if the development community were to come out and convince you that that number needs to be somewhat higher, that's a question you can entertain. The number is a little bit arbitrary, but any number we put in there would be arbitrary at this point. And if I put a range of 40 to 45 or whatever, really in reality, the upper number is always going to be the limit.
So the committee would like action by the council, so we're making a motion.
I don't see any red flags here other than the question you brought up with the number. So I would motion that we go ahead with what's proposed.
Okay. Motion by David Knapp, is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Gary Benson. Any discussion? More?
I'll just throw out one thing just for information purposes. As we've talked about it, we think that the number, if you're going to adopt a phased approach and limit allocations by phasing, that number is actually going to go into the code, which would be the thing that goes to Planning Commission. So to the extent that that's the red flag, recognize that that's something that you'll get Planning Commission feedback on.
One other question. So this policy that we're creating is going to be phased out at some point within 5 years, so.
Right. It becomes, we would build into whatever policy statement kind of a termination of it, right? Ultimately, the final, it could continue really until all those infrastructure, Dave, am I wrong? Until we find a way to put the language in that until that 36 parallel is in, this is the policy for development on the west side.
Yeah, all in favor of the motion? Yes. Unanimous, we'll excuse David Soul and,
Thank you. And we'll move forward from you here.
Item 5, a discussion regarding potential sensitive lands ordinance amendment, and this will be presented by Bill Carboni, Director of Development Services.
I understand you have a very full agenda, you're 20 minutes behind already, so I'll be brief. 6 or 8 months ago, a committee of some staff and some council members began to meet to talk about a grading permit that was issued in the mouth of Provo Canyon that had some controversy that went along with it. So that committee looked at amending our grading section of the code of Title 15 to address the issues that came up as a result of that specific problem. During that discussion, council members asked, should we take a more comprehensive look at hillside or sensitive lands regulations in the city? Council staff pulled a copy of Salt Lake County's Foothills and Canyons overlay zone. It's commonly referred to as the FCAUS. And that was looked at for a couple of meetings, looking at all of that entails and where it differs from our ordinances. And these are the sections within that ordinance, which does go into much more detail than our Titles 14 or 15. The question for the City Council simply is, do you see need or value in hillside regulations that you would like staff to bring back to you something more similar to the FCAUS as opposed to what we have in our current Title 15? This is Title 15, legislative intent. That's legislative intent of the FCAUS. So just in that, you can see quite a big difference. In the actual sections, we don't talk about clustering development. We don't talk about tree and vegetation protection. We don't talk about wildlife habitat protection. We don't talk about any kind of design standards. This is pretty good in terms of not only language, but in graphics showing you what you're not supposed to do and what the ordinance tells you have to do when you develop in the hillsides. Mr. Henley looks like he wants to say something. So.
So, it seems like once upon a time we had areas designated as environmentally sensitive, and it was off limits. And then it was like, well, if you can kind of mitigate the problems, we'll consider, or we'll let you build. I think this is the right step to address those unique problems that you find in these environmentally sensitive areas.
I would just add a couple other thoughts. I mean, I think in our previous discussions on the committee and just looking at the FCAUS ordinance, it seemed to me that cluster development and design standards are pretty important and valuable to the city to have as tools, so that we can, if and when we allow certain developments to happen, we can make them happen in a way that protects the qualities of the foothills. So, you know, I think where we kind of left off on our discussions prior to presenting this here was a sense that we may not end up adopting all of these. There was language in the FCAUS that really pertained more to major canyon areas where there are ski resorts and so on, which may be beyond what we have a need for, but it does seem to me that questions of how the development, where and why you allow developments and what kinds of developments you're going to allow is important, not only because of the sensitive nature of those lands, but also because of their visibility. Right? They're unlike any other kind of development where they're going to be seen from just about anywhere you are in the city. And if we don't think carefully about what those standards might be, we could be in for a very disappointing result that we have to stare at for a very, very long period of time. So I think doing this right and really carefully is really in order. So I certainly would recommend that we move forward on trying to determine what aspects of the ordinance we think are most useful to us.
These design standards certainly do address what Mr. Hanley is referring to. You've heard me say before that zoning ordinances are very good at expressing what a city doesn't want to have happen, but when a developer asks, well, what do you want? Zoning ordinances don't express that very well at all. That's what design guidelines do, the ones we have in our downtown zones, and then these also. So as staff, we can spend a lot of time working on ordinances or projects that one or two council members believe strongly in, but it helps make our time productive if we know that the majority of council thinks that's something we should do, and so that's really what we're here to ask.
Let me read Mr. Hardy's comment on this one. It says, I like how the preamble of the Salt Lake County program talked about balancing the interests of all stakeholders. I'm looking for that in whatever proposal we entertain. He asks the question, how does this effort correlate with the coming effort by CNS, which is
Community Neighborhood Services.
Yeah, thank you, and residents in Northeast Provo to create an area master plan similar to what was done in Southeast Provo? That was his question.
I don't know the answer to that. I've seen a letter from a group of the Northeast residents asking that a neighborhood plan have time to be adopted before anything changes in that area. But that's direction we need to get. Again, that's direction we need to get from the council.
Any feedback council members like to give to Bill this time?
So it seems like we have two things going on here. We have this structure framework that we work on and that is needed, but we also have a neighborhood plan or an area plan that would have resident input and hopefully not conflict with what we come up with here. They should kind of be in harmony.
If the neighborhood plan were to move forward, my recommendation would be that the neighborhood plan and this ordinance be written concurrently, so they both come to you pretty much at the same time, so you can see exactly what we're getting, what you're getting, and how they complement each other.
I'll second that.
Yeah, that would be my strong preference. I think, like I say, I think there's a lot at stake in making sure we get this right, and I think the best way to get it right is kind of do it from the ground up, listening to the neighborhood and looking carefully at a lot of these particular aspects that we don't currently have in code. And I really like the idea of coordinating that effort so that we're not at cross purposes potentially. So I don't know, do we need to pass a motion to that effect, or what would be most helpful to you?
Yeah, I think a motion just to this question as to whether or not you would like staff to proceed with legislation like this. Some motion would be helpful. My experience tells me that this would take less time to write than we would plan. So this would be done while the neighborhood plan is going on.
How long would the neighborhood plan take, do you think?
If you ask that question, because every time I've given an answer, it's been longer than what we expected. Because we now have staff dedicated to that, and because of the more defined area we'd be working in this neighborhood plan, I would hope 6 months. But again, that's a question for Gary McGinn, because that's under his, the planners are under him, not me, those planners.
Well, go ahead. Well, I don't know that we have to wait 6 months to do this, right?
Right.
And if we do this in the next little while, and we have something on the books for the neighborhood to be looking at as they're developing their plan, then that seems like we create the opportunity for harmony. I suppose in theory it's possible that they come up with something that is in contradiction to the plan, to the code that we may have already adopted. What would happen then?
If we do something.
Say we draft this up, we approve it, and then they say, well, we want to tweak, we want a neighborhood plan that allows for X, Y, or Z that you don't have there in the code.
It can be amended at any time.
Okay.
You can be amended at any time, or what if we just leave it as a draft?
That's what I would suggest. Gary McGinn just walked in. Gary, I just committed for you that your group could do a neighborhood plan up northeast in 6 weeks. So.
The next item on your agenda is appropriation from one department to another. I'm fine with that.
My fear would be that this can be done, that we don't get the neighborhood plan done in time to get the protection that caused us to do this. Are we vulnerable for 6 months without this ordinance in place?
Would it be pending legislation?
Even if it's a draft?
It's noticed, but then it's only pending legislation for 6 months, and then you have got to adopt something or the old rules apply.
Yeah, that seems manageable. So I guess if you're looking for a motion, I would move that we move forward with developing a draft of an ordinance that is inspired by or drawn from the best elements of the FCAUS ordinance that we look at again at a later point as a potential rough draft, and that in the meantime we encourage the neighborhood plan to move forward as soon as possible.
So Stuart had his hand up.
Just wanted to clarify, the reason we're doing this is because of the project that was proposed, the Bob Dylan project.
No, I think the reason this is being done is because of the grading that took place into the mouth of Provo Canyon, and that caused concern.
Is the Bob Dylan project still in process? I got
It is,
yes. Yesterday.
It is.
I thought it was continuing, it wasn't progressing, but it is progressing.
Yeah, they have filed an application for a general plan amendment, so that has to go to Planning Commission and then to you, and then it has to go through our process. Unless they withdraw it, it has to go through our process.
I think maybe the neighborhood plan urgency is more related to that.
Right, the neighborhood plan portion.
But this goes back to the gravel pit very early on, as I met with some of the citizens who were very concerned about that. They raised the question as to whether or not, one was Kim Santiago, former council member, raised the concern that we didn't have adequate protections of foothills in Provo, and that was something that she felt like the city council ought to be working on, and so that was what initiated this conversation, and eventually we had a meeting with some of the people in Salt Lake County who had worked on this ordinance to learn from them. So yeah, that was before all this.
Elizabeth, did you get the motion down that yours made? Is there a second for that motion? Dave Connect, second. And is there any more discussion? All in favor of that motion then? And that is unanimous. Dave Hardy and Dave Sewell.
Thank you.
Thank you. Item 6 is an ordinance amending Provo City Code to correct and update section 3.08.010, which is the official's oath and bonds required. And this will be by
I suspect this is a topic you're familiar with. And the key points, the key issues as were summarized in the materials are that the city code requires all officials to take the oath of office and execute the bond, but does not specify who working at the city would be classified as an official. The state code is not entirely clear about that either. Or as you will recall, during the last year, multiple cities have received multiple grammar requests about this issue, and it's become obvious that there are different interpretations about what it takes to meet the city code requirements and state code requirements. The state code was amended at the last legislative session in an effort apparently to clarify that. And the proposed revisions, actually a repeal and a reenactment of Provo City Code 3.08.010 specifies which city officers need to take the oath and execute a bond, and is consistent with current Utah Code sections 10-3-27, and then there's a typo, it should read through 831, from 827 through 831. And also with Title 10, Chapter 3, Part 9, which deals with appointed officials and their duties. So this is an update and a clarification.
Any questions? Ms. Williams? This will be on tonight's agenda. So here it is tonight. Okay, thank you. Next item is a discussion regarding a parking permit program policy. And this is going to be presented by Council Chair David Hardy. I can raise his comments from this item, and then we'll have discussion, I guess. So since I started paying attention to issues before the council, I've seen several parking permit programs proposed, but only one or two actually created. Usually the applicants withdraw their request once they realize all that they entail. With our new license plate readers and with the direction of the Joaquin and downtown parking committees, parking permit programs have changed, and I believe that they will continue to change in the near future. We've already made the changes to LPRs, and I believe we'll be a new mobile pay system downtown and in Joaquin. I believe that we should have a cohesive and coherent system across the city, but I don't know what that looks like in the established areas and in the areas that are currently expressing interest in starting new programs. I think we should accommodate residents and their desires for their neighborhoods, but I also think we need to be careful about assigning public resources to private use. I definitely feel that permit programs should pay for themselves over the long run. Anyone else from that committee that would like to?
This isn't necessarily a committee issue. was just something you wanted to discuss.
Okay.
Is this, Dave's not here to explain, I mean, there was a proposal from the Carterville neighborhood that I've been in conversation with them about, and I didn't know if Dave had reservations about that, because of his desire to want to have a more global conversation about the policy in general.
Based off our discussions in leadership, I don't think that he's necessarily opposed to it. I think the process is that tonight we'll have a public hearing to see if there's sufficient interest in starting the study. And then, so this is just to start. For Carterville. And then after 90 days, I think they're required to come back and give us another report. And at that point, the council can decide whether they want to move forward with it. But we'll have information about how much it will cost to each resident if they want to get a permit, and other information like what the restrictions will be. All that will be detailed out in that report. So I'm not entirely sure that this is totally related to that, but I do think that he wants to have a more holistic discussion about parking in Provo City and permit projects and how we're moving forward with those. So I don't know that it relates to any, I was just saying I don't think it relates to any one committee.
I didn't know if there was, I mean, he has a lot more experience than I do with parking permit mishaps and so on, but the Carterville case, which we'll hear about later, seemed to me to be, you have these little strange pockets in the city where you have unusual parking problems. Right. This neighborhood seems to be kind of off the charts in terms of their problems, and I'm not sure that I can offer any other alternative to a parking permit program that would give them the results that they want. I assume we would all be open to what those would be, but I didn't have a sense that there was a problem with a city having a half dozen parking permits programs throughout the city, or if that somehow ends up being too expensive or hard to manage, hard to enforce. I don't know, Gary, if you have any thoughts on that, or.
Sure. Parking permit programs, I think you're absolutely right. Every neighborhood has a slightly different issue dealing with parking, and some neighborhoods may be impacted a little more than others of the same nature. Some are near high commuter uses. Others are near, say, a lot of residential, and it's overnight parking. And so, as far as enforcement goes, to the greatest extent possible, we would be looking to have common things and common ways of enforcing it. It makes it easier for us to enforce. Now, having said that, the most important thing to us is that we get the nature of the regulations for that neighborhood right, so that it really helps meet the goals and accomplish the goals that the neighborhood and the council is looking for in any program. And so that will be the overriding thing, is to make sure we do that. And then as tonight in your hearing, our ordinance allows a neighborhood group to come in and talk about why they think they may need one. Then if there's sufficient interest on the council to frankly have us do a lot of work, because we'll end up doing a lot of work on this, if the council believes it's important enough to go down that road, then we begin a study, and we'll go out there and we do counts, and we look at things, and we come up with creative ways to try and accomplish the same thing that the neighborhood's looking to accomplish with as minimum of an impact on people as we can. We take it through the different administrative departments to make sure there are no problems or special things that we haven't considered. And then at the end of the time, and it's either 90 or 120 days, they can never keep it straight without looking. We come back with a report to the council on what our recommendation would be and how it would be best and easiest for the city to achieve the goals that this neighborhood would have, and then as the council could implement that program. Part of that would be the specific rules that would take place in those areas. And so that's just something and we're in the middle of doing one on Slate Canyon right now, looking at that. We'll be back January or February
can't remember, with a report to the city council.
So, I think it's important, like you mentioned, Gary, that we have some, as much as possible, some consistency
Yeah.
between programs so that it's not too difficult to administer. Like, gee, I just crossed the imaginary line, now it's a different standard. And I don't think we have right now a chart that shows different programs and the details and differences or commonality. They've been implemented over such a long period of time, and yes, maybe there were different needs, but there was also different ways of thinking and whatever. I think it would be good to review, chart it out and review what we have out there. And there are some pain points in some of the neighborhoods, like in the Seven Peaks and the Belmont Arlington area. When I was walking that area, people would complain how difficult it was to have a visitor or a party. And if nothing else, our technology can change how it's done so that it's easier. But there's differences in time and enforcement, like, you know, do you care if it's enforced on the weekends or holidays? And it would be nice to have more consistency, but without knowing what's out there, I think it's hard to know what are the good and bad points.
And with that, when I saw this item on the agenda, I had assumed that it was not a general discussion about the process to implement a parking permit program area, but that it was maybe more of a discussion to have with the council of should we do exactly what you were suggesting, Dave, is come back, and we are starting to get more of these, and it's hard for people just to keep track generally of what they do, and technology has changed since some of these were implemented. And maybe it's time for a review of these areas with the council to see if this is really accomplishing what the council had hoped would be accomplished, and that the residents in those areas had hoped it would be accomplished. Because there's nothing worse than if we're spending all this time and effort and we're really not achieving what people need and want.
So with that said, that became a talking point at most every door in the neighborhood. Some people brought it up, and for those that said, oh, my neighborhood's great, like, yeah, there's nothing to talk about. And so we'd go, what about the parking permit? Oh, yeah, there's that. So they always had an opinion, and then
Way to bring it up.
and after hearing their complaints about it, which is usually, you know, they would have some complaint, you'd say, oh, well, so do you want us to get rid of the program? Oh, no, no, no. It was this love-hate affair where there were certain things about it they really didn't appreciate, but they didn't want to get rid of it. Because they remember how it used to be. So being able to identify those pain points and say, okay, maybe we can modify it, make it easier and better for more functional for the neighborhood, and at the same time more uniform from neighborhood to neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think a periodic review of those things would be good to do. And so that would be a good exercise for us to go through anyway.
Okay. Having been a member of that community in the past, I think 7 and 8 really need to probably be delayed until Dave's here. Does anybody really wants to have read the minutes of the meetings? Probably just kind of explain the direction of the committee, that it's Dave and Dave that are here that are members of the committee. I think 7 and 8 would probably just pass on for the both here.
The downtown parking committee.
Parking committee that I was member of.
Oh, that's Joaquin, yeah, but I think this was specific to downtown parking, and Dave and Gary are moving on that.
Talking about 8 or 9?
8. So 8 is the downtown Provo parking. Okay. I told him to be on this one, I think he has to.
So item 8, Dave Harding would probably be very pleased if you had gone adopted the vision statement, but I think if you were opposed to it, he would want to be here to defend it and try and persuade you.
Okay, so we're finishing up item 7 then. That was just a general discussion anyway, but I think we got some good feedback, and I think that feedback's important too. As we consider Carterville, if we have something historically and say how the others work, how do we do a Carterville? That might help.
And with Carterville, as we've had this discussion, I think we're in the middle of doing a report on Slate Canyon. We're gathering information. We're going to be talking more with the neighborhood to make sure we really understand what they're trying to accomplish. We'll be coming back with a recommendation. As a part of that report, I think it would be good, as I hear this conversation, to come in and have a little appendix to that report or something that integrate the other parking areas and what they're currently doing, so that you can see that on a high level. And then maybe at some future time we could have a conversation about, is this working in those areas? Do we need to tweak some things? And we'll be thinking about those issues to see what changes in technology and how we can do things, how we can make that better.
Very good then. Let's go to discussion item number 8 regarding the downtown Provo parking program. Again, Councilor Harding is going to present this, so
He has a statement also.
yes, he does. And is that vision? Oh, there it is right there. Okay, and Dave's comment regarding this item. I think the vision should be easy to adopt. It is a feel-good statement about all we want downtown Provo to be. But it is also an important tool to focus our efforts and to help us know how to weigh options and choices as we strive to implement the vision. The proposed policy is a bigger deal. There will be real impacts if we choose to go down this road. This is a change from how we've been doing things. The committee, made up of 3 council members, high-level administrative officers and staff, and Quinn Peterson from DPI, feel that this change will give us much more value for the resources that we've invested and continue to invest in parking downtown. We feel that this proposal is aligned with the 2013 Strategic Downtown Parking Plan, and while bold is the next logical step in its implementation. There's another paragraph. The impact of this policy change can be illustrated by revisiting a recent downtown parking decision. When working with PEG on the Freedom Plaza project, which included the new state courthouse and convention center parking, we stated that we weren't in the business of managing parking garages and instead paid millions into PEG's parking structure for them to manage. The long-term results of similar decisions in the past have been less than stellar. See the Town Square Garage and the Marriott Garage. This policy change means that we are in the business of managing garages, and in the future we would be investing the same money into garages that the city would own and operate and that private developers could pay into to meet their parking obligations. This policy change would also enable us to look at past investments, think the Provo Town Square Garage, for example, and consider if it makes sense to take over operation.
Question? Administration, do you want to manage the parking facility?
Beauty of this is Isaac's been kind of heading this up, so.
Well, at least, yeah, certainly a member at the table, as well as Gary McGinn, who's here. And I think the thing I would add to all that is this is a high-level vision that opens that door a little more wide, that this is a path we can pursue, and sort of places it, and it doesn't say it in there, but it would be Mr. McGinn, Director of Community and Neighborhood Services, who with his team would explore options, look at a very incremental way to move in the direction of a vision where, yeah, there's some harmony and stability and predictability, ease for people visiting Provo with parking that isn't there right now. But yeah, this is definitely not opening up that you know, next month we're going to tell you we want to spend $3 million to buy this facility or build this or whatever. But it sets us on a path to look at that and bring decisions to you like that and say, here's one piece of the puzzle that's next, and we think this one makes sense. Over time, this might mean building a more robust parking department within community and neighborhood services, or building an independent parking authority or different things. So I think it's probably good for you to think about some of, the way Mr. Harding has framed it is certainly appropriate and helpful, but I would add that other perspective that this is not committing any concrete actions at this point. It's really just saying, here's our vision, and we like this vision, so work on it, and come bring to us pieces of the puzzle as they arise that will require a budget or anything like that, and move us in that direction. So I hope that's helpful, and Gary might want to add anything, if it's okay. I know he'd be happy to speak if we'd like to hear from him.
Yeah, I think it's also, we are already in the parking business because we do own parking stalls. And if we're just letting somebody else manage it, we don't have felt in the past that they have not been managed. Maintaining them has not been to the standard that I think we would like to see. And those are community assets. And we just, as a committee member, we just felt we want to make sure that we are covering our assets and protecting those assets. And we talked about financing it, and Gary assured us that as we do this, we are not going to go out and be asking for a lot of money. We're going to create plans that will actually be self-sustaining, that will work within the community. We're not looking to ask for subsidies around this.
From my perspective in dealing with parking planning, parking enforcement, in some aspects the city is in the parking business. We have parking on our roads and we regulate that. Over the years as a city, we've also through the redevelopment agency have given money and or ground upon which parking structures are built. And so we do have a relationship dealing with parking structures and how they run and operate. In the past, the policy of the city has been to help a project work, we'll give money, and often that can come through subsidies for parking. And so parking garages and things like that get built to handle it. And our approach has been each individual project that comes in needs to be responsible for its own parking. And there's some good reasons to do that. There are also some good reasons not to do that. And some of the reasons not to do that would be you have better management of parking if you look at parking in an area rather than project by project. If you can look at the parking needs for an entire area, you can then manage that parking on street and off street to help things work better with the different types of uses, retail, office, residential, that they work and function well. Now, we do have interest in parking garages, and so we are, for lack of a better word, entangled with those, and we have to decide what we're going to do as a city with those. And I think what this, in my mind, this policy doesn't, and if anybody reads it, that it commits us to, that we want to build and own parking structures. I don't think that was the intent of this, and we need to make sure that it doesn't say that initially. I think what it says, or is hoping to say, is that parking for the benefit of downtown, from an economic standpoint, from a residential standpoint, a quality of life standpoint, for all those who either work here or live or come to shop and do things in Provo, how do we maximize that experience downtown is in the parking sense? That parking is always your first and last experience somebody has in your downtown. And how can we ensure that's a high level experience? And so as we go through this, there are things that need to be done. We have to make some decisions here in the next year or so on what are we going to do with these parking garages that, in which we have an interest. And we do. We either own the ground or we have a management agreement, and we need to manage those better. Those have not been managed very well in the past. And so part of this, I think, really is if the council wants to look at and think of parking as a utility in that the city is involved in making sure parking is available and managed well, then what that does is it's kind of a trigger for us, again, to start working and putting substantial effort into coming back eventually with recommendations on how we would deal with the parking garages, how we would deal with these things. And what Mr. Winterton was talking about is, I don't see anything coming out of my department that is not sustainable financially. I mean, it just has to be. If we can't sustain this, it just doesn't make sense and it won't work.
Are you looking for a motion to authorize you to move ahead on that, in that direction? I can make that motion, that's easy.
And I think that is probably helpful, as well as a motion to, can we scroll to the top of this language?
Adopt the vision and the policy.
Adopt the following. So I guess we might suggest a motion that adopts the vision, the policy, and the direction that we've been describing here.
Brian, would you pass such a motion for me?
I think Isaac just did it.
That's my motion.
Adopt the downtown parking vision, the downtown parking policy, and the direction, that's part of it.
And the direction discussed in this meeting, right? I'm just quoting Isaac.
I think it would be to authorize Gary to create, begin working on policies that would support the downtown parking policy and vision.
Move forward with that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but Gary doesn't need your authorizations. So, I mean, if you're adopting the policy so he knows that's what he's working towards, then I...
Don't need to have or authorize him to do anything.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, the motion's been made, is there a second? Dave Connect, second. Any other discussion? All in favor of the motion? And it's affirmative, I think, excuses, Dave Sewell, Dave Hardy.
Okay, if I could just interject here, I really do appreciate the council taking this step, because with an incremental approach with things that we'd like to do here, this is one of those incremental steps. We want to make sure the council is feeling comfortable before we start expending too much time, effort, or money on things, just to make sure we're headed in the right direction and we're not getting out in front of where the council would want to be on something like this.
I can't speak for the council as a whole, but it's a major issue here. Major thing that needs to be taken care of. So this is going to move ahead.
Very good. Thank you. Item number 9 is a discussion regarding an update on parking enforcement in the new department structure. And Mayor and Isaac, who will present, I know this has Wayne's name in it.
So,
Good. Tell us.
yeah, Wayne's on vacation. This is parking again, Isaac. Is this the one
Oh.
Wayne asked you to?
Is this the parking one?
Parking enforcement.
Thank you, sure, yeah, I'll handle that one, appreciate
We've all
that.
have been, it's
Sorry, we
been
were
divvied
just-
out.
we
We're
were
just trying to
conferring on
figure
a
out
couple
which one
things.
is which.
So this goes back to sort of a vision point that the mayor has been very strong about, and that is, we have an opportunity to build a new building. Let's think really long and hard before we commit ourselves to too many design elements about getting our organization the way it needs to be. Building is one thing, but the organization is a separate one. The whole, new department is a part of that effort, of course, to have a new development services department. But there's been more than that, and we've spent a lot of time, a lot of hours meeting with every director and trying to turn the whole organization, piece by piece and look at, is everything in the right place and are people in the right place? And as part of that, an idea surfaced and was fully vetted and ultimately got just widespread support, and that was that we should maybe take our parking enforcement and our business licensing and take them from customer service and put them under communities and neighborhood services with Gary McGinn as director. And some of the thoughts there, when you're talking about this emphasis on parking and getting parking right, Gary's been good at pointing out that a lot of what that entails is really a planning function. But it's important to have planning and the people who are thinking about the vision and what you're shooting for and the enforcement arms aligned. And so it seemed to be a good step to move parking enforcement under the same umbrella, as it were, as parking planning and everything else that goes on with parking. Similarly, one of the issues with business licensing that we've had, and I wanted to say this, the people involved with these moves are all outstanding people. You've heard the thing of you've got to get the right people on the bus and the people in the bus in the right seats. This is definitely our right seats. And I want to praise everybody involved here, Sandy and Jesse and everyone else. We're very pleased with their work, and they've been very supportive of this move. Even though it is, of course, it's always hard to move a department and everything else. But with our business licensing, we've never really had any enforcement capability because you've got customer service department and you've got business licensing. Well, in Gary McGinn's department, in community and neighborhood services, he's got enforcement staff, and they can be kind of cross-trained. And so if they're out there working on a rental dwelling license enforcement issue, but they're already trained also on business licensing issues and can get that training, then we've done some good vertical integration of having everything under the right house with the right leadership and the right ability to coordinate and get to know each other and synergize and all that. And we've also just more efficient use of our resources and better use of our resources, because again, we're really excited that for the first time in at least a long time, we're going to have some ability to do some business licensing enforcement, and that'll be new. So those are kind of the main high point issues on that. If there are any questions, I'm here, Gary's here.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I think this is part of the mayor's long-term strategy, not to get things right and to make sure things are housed where it makes most logical sense for the benefit of Provo City. And there's some economies of scale that we can have with business licensing and the enforcement, and especially with some of the conversations the council's having with apartment licensing and A&S overlays and the direction some of these things will go, to have that integration in the department, one department working together on it makes a lot of sense. And the same thing with parking, as we're doing parking and planning and strategizing over these things and parking permit program areas, to bring that in-house, the enforcement of those things, to make sure we're accomplishing the goals as we establish and set a vision together in the department, and work with the council to make sure we're in alignment with your vision. I think that gives us just a better economy of scale and an ability to be more quick and nimble in how we react to issues that come up.
And the whole purpose was, again, I just keep stating, I don't want to wait until we have our new building and then move in and test this. We need to figure it out now and make all our mistakes now and figure it out, so by the time we go in there, we're running smooth and well. And I will say, moving people is not easy, and they took it like champs and jumped on and saw the vision of it did make more sense to go under Gary and work as a team and not have to send people, oh, sorry, I can help you with this piece, but now go over to that piece to handle that piece over there. It's the right thing to do.
Would you like us to voice support?
Always be good, Joel.
Yeah, it's our understanding there's no motion needed, but support is always welcome.
Support is always welcome. Appreciate it.
No, I appreciate the time. I know we're in a hurry to get that building going and everything, but it's time to do it right. And then the hardness of changing people in departments.
They've been there for
We've done it.
13
You've
years,
done it.
18 years, and then have to say, because of our move and what's the best fit for the citizen. My vision every time I walk in the building in my mind is, if I'm a citizen walking in off the street and I have this question, how am I going to get it answered the most effectively without having to be sent to two different places? And that's kind of been our vision in trying to get us in that new building in the right place.
On this particular issue, I think you're doing the right thing, so I personally would make a motion that we support what the administration has done in this area. If you need a motion.
We'll take one.
I second.
Any discussion about the motion?
Just a quick question. We're getting all the same people on the bus, it sounds like, is what you're telling us here. We're not having to let anyone leave, or we're just
Just
maybe
moving and
making...
getting them in the right seats,
And
so it makes more sense.
they're still basically doing the same things that they were doing,
Yes.
but they're doing it a different, maybe under a different umbrella.
And where they'll have support as well.
We have 2 different buses, now we have 1 bus.
Thank you, Gary. That's the vision, right?
And you're still the driver.
Too many metaphors.
Don't remind us of that.
We have a motion, a second. All in favor of the motion? It's unanimous. Excuse Councilman Sewell and Harding. We're going to have a 5-minute break, if we could, right now. And we'll meet back in 5 minutes. Start our meeting for item 12, which is a resolution appropriating $98,432 in the general fund for an economic development director position in the Development Services Department. And David Mortensen from the Budget Office will present.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for giving me a few minutes of your time. As you'll recall, a few weeks ago, we requested an appropriation that basically transferred funds from the Development Services Division or Department into the Mayor's office to enable us to have an assistant CAO. That left Development Services without an Economic Development Director or the funding for it. And so tonight we'll be requesting an appropriation, as was mentioned, $98,431 from fund balance to the Development Services Department so that they can hire a Economic Development Division Director. So just to let you know how that amount was calculated, because this position would be starting mid-November is the anticipated start date. There's about 7.5 months left out of the fiscal year. And so they'd be starting at an M1 grade, at the midpoint of the M1 grade. And so if you take 7.5 divided by 12 and multiply it by that pay rate, that's how we got the $98,431. With that, I'll answer any questions that anyone may have.
Any questions for Mr. Mortensen? I see none, so
Okay.
we'll just see you tonight.
See you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next item is a discussion regarding updates to Title 18 of City Code, including associated drainage manual and management program. And it says Dave Decker will present, but
Looks like Dave stepped out. I'm Rob Hunter, I'm the stormwater engineer, so he was going to do an introduction, I think, originally, but we can just go through it. But so we're going through, as it says, we're proposing updates to our Title 18. Today is just a discussion, and depending on, I guess, the feedback, we'll determine when we come with a resolution to actually adopt the code changes. So it's Title 18 code revisions, and then the drainage manual and our stormwater management program documents are adopted by reference into Title 18. Let's see. There we go. The reason why we're doing these updates, the basic is that a lot of this has not been updated for a very long time, especially our drainage manuals from 1986. As you can imagine, has some stuff that's outdated. So the reason why we're doing it is some items that we need to be able to regulate are not covered in our current code. Our drainage manual is, like I said, 30 plus years old, so some of the methodologies are outdated. It actually was a very good manual for its time, pretty forward-looking, but at this point some of the methodologies are outdated and some of the items don't match other parts of the code. So we need to make sure that everything's matching. We need to match our storm drain master plan. Most specifically, if you remember when we came in January, I believe, to update the master plan, we were moving from a 25-year design storm for our storm drain to a 10-year design storm. We also updated the impact fee plan, and some of the wording in the code does not match how impact fees are calculated. So we need to update that. And then there are water quality related items per our MS4 permit. Our MS4 permit, the MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems. Basically, municipalities and counties that have a large storm drain system have to be permitted by the state to be able to discharge stormwater into the state waters, which include Provo Bay, Utah Lake, and Provo River, where all of our water goes. And there's a lot of regulations that are associated with that permit that we have in the state that then we have to regulate, or we have to do inspections, we have to perform certain items on. And so some of these proposed updates are not necessarily, I guess, are driven by the state regulations. And most specifically, we had audits in 2011 and 2015 that some of these updates are finally addressing. Audits meaning that somebody from Department of Water Quality came down and said, here's what we find wrong with your program, and you need to fix it. So we can go through those. Kind of a time frame. Once again, in January 2019, we came through our storm drain master plan update. Now we're going to update our Title 18, our design manual, and our management program. We are intending to coincide with the development standards update, the Public Works development standards update, which I believe y'all will see within the next few weeks. They're at Planning Commission right now. Title 18 doesn't need to go through Planning Commission, but they're there right now. And then there's also going to be a floodplain ordinance update, which needs to go to Planning Commission first also. But then again, in February or March of next year, we're going to need to come back and specifically update our water quality centric regulations. The reason is that our MS4 permit that I was just talking about has a standard in there that is a step significantly above and beyond what has been required in the past. We are working with the City Engineers Association, the League of Cities and Towns, and the Home Builders Association on updates to that permit wording. It is very stringent. Everybody's trying to work together to help the state rewrite it to where it's manageable. That's being rewritten right now, and so we're going to have to wait until just before the implementation date goes into effect to know what the new rules are and then update our regulations accordingly. The way that I intended to go through this is I've kind of got a summary slide for all of these, and then I also do have all the major updates. Some of it were just slight wording, grammar fixes, but any of the major updates I do have a slide for if you want to go deeper into it. But I guess up front, all I was going to do is kind of do an overview of what the changes to the code are, an overview of what the kind of the big items and the changes to the manual, and then once again, if you want to delve deeper, I put it on here for 30 minutes, anticipating that there might be questions, but I'm okay with it going faster. Also, that all depends on what y'all need. So in 1801, our storm kind of sets up the stormwater utility. There was minor wording changes according to fix things that we had in the MS4 permit audit where the state came down. One was to reference the state regulatory authority as opposed to just the national regulatory authority, and then we also updated some of the definitions associated with the permit. So we looked at the state regulations and or state definitions and the definitions that were also contained actually in our MS4 permit, and updated our definitions to match. And it doesn't really change anything, it just gets us more in line and addresses those concerns that the state had. We are proposing to add back, in terms of officially in the code, add back utility fee credits that we've always given. The utility fee, we've given credits for a 25% credit for detention and a 50% credit for retention. That always was part of the code, and as far as I can tell, because I was not here at the time, from the staff that was here at the time, they believe was inadvertently left out of one of the revisions, left out of the code changes, but in practice, those have always been given. And so we're proposing to add those back in. In 18.02, we are specifying some escalating enforcement. That is also required by our MS4 permit. Basically, if people purposefully dump anything other than stormwater into our storm drain system, right now it's written in that it's a Class C misdemeanor and there are fines associated with it. What the state requires is that there's escalating fines, and so we write in some of that escalation. The other thing that we do is fees and violation costs, the cost of cleanup if we have to do it, can be put on the property as a lien. We are proposing to give the city the option where it's associated with work that's permitted and bonded by the city, that we have the option of having it be a lien upon the bond, which is much easier for us to recover than having a lien on the property. It just makes it an easier way to deal with that. 18.03 is our regulations, the stormwater regulations for development. Like I said, there's our regulatory documents are adopted by reference. Anything that is specifically development related, there were a couple of items. One was an easement requirement, and one was the type of report that you have to submit, and we just moved those. Those make more sense, and it's similar to what sewer or the water resources division in our department was doing, is moving those to our guidelines and our manual instead of having those in the code. If it's specifically for development, we want to have one location where the developers can go to and see it, and that's our manual. We also add in the option for reimbursement for master plan facilities, similar to what we have for sewer and for water. If a development needs to build a master plan facility, we're just writing in there the option of doing a 10-year plan. Basically, they pay for it up front, and there's a 10-year plan for paying them back. It's very similar to what we already have with water and sewer, and so we're just proposing that also for the storm drain utility. And then we're adding the master plan. We're proposing to add the master plan to one of the referenced documents also. And then there's no changes in 18.04, which is our stormwater pollution prevention plan bond. Basically, every construction project has to have a plan of how to control their site where there's no pollutants in the discharge. And we one of our bond costs is for that, and we're not proposing any changes to that at this time. So I'm just going to skip through these. These are the actual red line changes, but if you want to go back and get into the weeds of any of these, I'd be happy to go through them.
I have a question.
Yes.
As you talk about this, it sounds to me like this is all on, it's mostly about development and how to develop within and using our storm drain system that we've got.
Yeah.
This is not addressing anything. I know that last year we had the second wettest year in state history.
Mm-hmm.
We're not addressing storms in this type of, this is about development, it sounds like. Is that correct?
It is mostly development, our changes, but it is our Title 18 really sets up the entire storm drain utility. And so most of our changes have to do with development, but not all of them. I mean, some of the things in terms of for example, our water quality program, it's not just what development's going to do, it's what we as the city are going to do.
I just look at, I was around for 1984, and I look what happened at Grandview 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago, that night, and I am very impressed with the changes and the things that we've done as a community. I've been told that 1980, we won't have any more third south rivers anymore because of things that we've done.
Our anticipation is that we won't have anything like we've had before. Our master plan really identifies where we're still deficient in our existing facilities and what we need to do to fix those, to upsize those. Our drainage manual, which is I guess besides the code is the main item that we're addressing here, is specifically for new development. Needs to do this to make sure that to where new development is not making things worse.
Thank you.
And then we're at the manual then. So our design manual, just as a kind of an overall compared to our current 1986 manual, we tried to make things a lot more efficient in terms of how we state things. So actually we have 3 times the chapters because there were things that weren't covered in our original manual, or at least were kind of hidden and not very clear as to where the regulations were at. So we have 3 times the chapters, but almost one quarter. We took out almost 3/4 of the number of pages that we have. So it's a lot more efficient coding. Our old manual was a lot more into the how to do things in terms of how hydrology works, how hydraulics work, what a storm drain system is, how to do the calculations. We're not trying to teach an engineer how to do his job. We're just saying, here's what the Provo regulations are. There's plenty of manuals in terms of the how to. And that's really where where most places are going at this point. It's just, here's our regulations. Don't have to search through a big long manual to figure out what is my requirement. Some of the notable changes that I just wanted to make sure that you as the council are aware that we are proposing. We clarified the drainage submittal for each type of submittal. So for a single family lot who's just coming in for a building permit, all we require is a lot grading plan that we can compare to what was approved during the project plan, make sure that it matches. What we require, which is once again pretty simple, just a kind of a conceptual layout of your drainage facilities for the conceptual plan, and then really only a report and detailed design in the project plan approval. Once again, we to match what we proposed and did for our storm drain master plan, we're changing the design storm from a 25-year to a 10-year. It's also consistent with our master plan. We're removing the detention requirement from single-family residential. We include easement sizes. There had been a section in the code, but that didn't actually specify what we require. Wasn't clear at all. So in the manual, we've moved that section to the manual, and we've actually stated for each type of facility and size of facility, here's the easement that we need to be able to get in there. And it's comparable to other local municipalities. And then one of the other big ones is that we clarify, we have a 1 foot of freeboard, meaning that whatever the floodplain elevation is, or the 100-year Utah Lake elevation, that you have to build 1 foot above that. And that's been our requirement for a long time. And we clarify what all that applies to. So that applies to residential buildings. Commercial buildings, you can either raise it to 1 foot above, or you could flood-proof. Flood-proofing for residential buildings isn't a viable option, but it is for some commercial buildings if they choose that. We clarify that we're expecting that the entire single-family lot is up out of the floodplain, so that a single-family homeowner doesn't have to deal with floodplain on their property and the legalities and the difficulties of selling their property that entails. Public roadways have to be a foot above. One that we are proposing that we did not have specified in there is that the building a 1 foot above along the Provo River, that apply to within 200 feet of the river. What we are trying to avoid, and has been implemented somewhat inconsistently over the history of Provo, but what we're trying to avoid is somebody, the map floodplain is an estimate. It's really based off of an elevation, and we don't want somebody to go right outside of what's mapped and then dig down 8 feet, because we know that that is high risk of flooding. The river can also affect the groundwater elevations when the river is high, but not for very far out. So we feel like a good buffer in terms of far enough out to where we feel comfortable that the river does not have effect beyond there, but covers us to where, like I said, it's gives us some cushion. Is a 200-foot corridor. So 200 feet away from the river, you have to be above the river elevation. Beyond that, if you're outside of the floodplain and you're 200 feet away from the river really doesn't affect you anymore.
Rob, what do you mean, 100 feet on each side or 200 feet on each side?
So a new bill would have a question, because we do have a current ordinance that does not allow building or development of any kind within 100 feet of the river. This, we're not saying you can't develop. You can build within that setback. You just can't have a finished floor elevation that is below the flood elevation of the river.
But it is written in the manual as 200 feet, within 200 feet of the river. So it'll be 200 feet on each side.
That's a 400-foot corridor then.
Yeah, 400 foot wide corridor. You'd have to, like I said, you could build. You just have to build above the river elevation.
So this is one we've had some hesitation on, and would definitely like your feedback. If you as a property owner purchase a lot next to the river and are expecting to have a basement, this would impact your ability to have a basement. This
Below
is
the river.
Correct. So assuming that the lot is graded to that 1 foot above the high elevation of the river, this would prohibit you from digging down from that, putting in a basement that is below that elevation. So we want to make sure that the council understands that completely. Again, to Rob's point, I think we're asking for trouble if we don't require some setback, whether 200 feet is the right setback. That's one that Rob feels pretty comfortable about.
No, so, go ahead, sorry.
So you were saying right now it's 100 feet on either side, you can't build anything at all?
Correct.
And now this would take it to 200 feet on either side, where yes, you could build, but you have to be above that level.
Correct.
And the 100-foot setback is separate from our drainage manual. I think it's written in Title 14 right now. So this 200-foot that we're proposing is not doing away with the 100-foot setback. This is just separate from that setback.
So this would basically then regulate what's between 100 and 200 feet away.
Yeah. And so part of my thinking in this is that it might be even as close as 100 feet away from the river. That at least in most areas, in the vast majority of areas, it doesn't appear that the river has effect beyond that 100 feet. But with the 100-foot setback, and especially with the conceptual Provo River corridor plan, we may be going in at some point, or development may be going in to widen out the river and reconnect a level down to the river. And so I guess that's part of my thinking in terms of making it a 200-foot setback, is that a 200-foot setback from the river building today may mean that, you know, when everything's widened out and the river, that what is right now a conceptual river corridor plan goes into effect, we may open up that river, make more connectivity to it, but then that also means when there's a 100-year storm, it's got a wider area to flood to. That brings it closer to the building. 200 feet, in my mind, gives me confidence that even if we go out and we reconnect that floodplain, kind of open up the river again, that they're still going to be far enough away to where we're not creating a flooding hazard in the future for them.
This is for all new development, new lots, or will it apply to existing lots then now with that 200?
It would apply to this.
Construction on existing lots.
This is any new construction on existing lots. Yeah.
Okay, any new construction then, okay.
Anything that would require a new permit, including building permits. Yeah.
Okay.
So
As soon as this goes into effect. Yeah.
Dixon just asked the question, does this apply to commercial? Again, commercial, if you go a couple lines back up, they have the option of doing flood proofing at a more reasonable, as a more reasonable alternative. So
Yeah.
parking garages, again, they can't build within 100 feet because that's a zoning thing. But under this proposal, commercial could build lower than that. They just have to provide engineered waterproofing measures.
Right. So that's what this is. The 1 foot freeboard is what we're requiring, and the 200-foot corridor is where it's applied.
So,
Are there any more questions on that?
We're asking for your feedback. We know this is one that potentially causes some heartburn. So we're looking for a little bit of direction. Again, we feel like there's a need for some sort of setback to try and protect homeowners from future problems. But again, what is the right distance, or should we require anything at all? Because again, this essentially eliminates a basement for ease of conversation on any riverfront lots.
I certainly don't feel like I'm in any position to tell you that's right or wrong. I mean, I sort of feel like I have to go by what you sense is the right thing, and your argument is very persuasive. So it seems to me to be a reasonable limitation. You're not stopping development, just saying you can't go down below that level. It seems pretty reasonable.
I would guess there's some homes now that don't fit into this.
For sure.
There are.
How will you deal with additions or remodels or?
Well, again, if it requires a building permit, we require that they meet the current standards, so that would prohibit any sort of additional basement.
Those would be primarily the sewage bottoms neighborhood that risk houses are pretty close, or
There's on the west side also, but those same, yeah. Some of those same homes that are down there are also ones that every time the river is high have a significant amount of pumping also. So that's somewhat the the reason behind some of these. We need to create a buffer.
Would they prefer to have built differently? I don't know. I mean, maybe some people obviously. I mean, I can imagine a scenario where they, for whatever reason, maybe the grade of the land, the water table's really sloping off to the left side of the river, and the right side of the river is pretty dry, right? Would you get people who are complaining that really doesn't apply to them, since they can, if they can identify that the water table isn't really even a factor?
I think so. I think we're going to get some complaints. The reason, and we could tie it to studies, but the reason why I think that tying it to a study is difficult at best is because we're really asking what's the effect during a 100-year flood event. And although within the last 2 or 3 winters we haven't had the 100-year, but we've had fairly high. We can go years without getting anywhere near that high, and so doing a piezometer test and seeing, okay, where's the water out on my property where I want to build compared to the river, for a lot of years,
Won't really tell you what
may tell you nothing. So
There's always an option of, indemnifying ourselves and say, if you get a letter from an engineer and you waterproof it, again, we find that pay enough money to a geotech engineer, they'll tell you basically what you want them to. I mean, unfortunately, and you may not ever see any problems, but we're trying to protect those residents that come into a situation after the fact and buy a home later on down the road.
not understanding that there may have been some questionable practices that with how their home was built.
The city needs to protect people themselves from themselves. Because if you don't require the city, they'll blame you when the time comes that they've done something they shouldn't have done. Mile High Drive is a perfect example. The roads were built up in Sherwood Hills, it shouldn't have been built. But the developers wanted to build and got permission, then they blamed the city for letting them doing it. So I fully support any regulation that you think is going to be protecting the city and the citizens from themselves.
Okay, appreciate that. The last item here that I just wanted to point out, some of these regulations are, well, we already had been regulating to the 1 foot above the 100-year, but with recent changes to the IBC, that is the requirement that is adopted. There's a document that's basically adopted by reference in the International Building Code and the International Residential Code. And in addition to that, there are some. It'll be very few and far between structures such as police stations, hospitals, schools, even some things like anything that's going to have hazardous material or cell towers that do have additional freeboard requirements per the International Building Code. And we just kind of reference, there's going to be some additional regulations on some critical facilities per the IBC. We just state that in the manual. We're not setting new regulations. We're just making them aware we have adopted the IBC, and so you're going to be subject, if you are one of those critical facilities, you're going to be subject to it. The stormwater management program, and I left some. I had failed to. I sent out with Elizabeth the code changes, the red line code changes, and our updated design manual. And I had failed to send out the stormwater management program. The engineer that works with me that had put that together had taken a week or week and a half off to study for the test, and I failed to grab that final document from her to send to you before she left for that. But I've got a few copies if you want to read it. And the reason why I say that, we're happy to give you any documentation and let you review as you need. The reason why the stormwater management program is maybe a little bit of less concern is that this is more, what is the city internally doing? It's a document that we've got to have per state regulations, and it has to be adopted into code per state regulations, but it's not really a regulatory document in terms of there's anything expected of anybody else. We state in here, here's the things that we do to try to preserve water quality. But any of the regulations that we impose on anybody are either done through code or done through our drainage manual. So, like I said, I do have some hard copies if you would like to review those, or we can send out a PDF copy of it. But it's not really regulations. It's more, what is my team going to do? So, with that, that's the overview. I think that's the end. If anybody has any questions, or if you wanted to delve deep into any of the other code, like I said, I'm happy to address any questions that you have. And I guess the final thing that we're looking for is, like I said, at least the storm or the Title 18 changes. We need to come to you all for adoption. The drainage manual, excuse me, and the management program are adopted by reference, and the way that the code is worded is that it can be updated, something along the lines of from time to time according to the discretion of the Public Works Director. These are some of them, major changes, especially with our design manual, hasn't been updated in 30 years. So this is not a minor change. That it's a big enough change where we definitely felt like this needs to be run by y'all. So we do at least need to bring Title 18 to you, make you aware of the changes of what we're proposing to do in the manual. And I guess the question is questions or concerns that when should we give you some time? Should we bring it, or are y'all comfortable with us bringing it to you at the next council meeting?
I guess you bring it to us when you're ready. I don't know that.
So,
Any concerns?
ideally, we had been on tonight's agenda. Not knowing concerns, we didn't do that. We're happy to put it on the next meeting agenda for adoption, or do you want to see us again in a work session, or do we just go straight to the consent agenda regular meeting and it's kind of...
One thing to note on this schedule, and I apologize for interrupting for just a second, but the design, the typical process that we go through every year with our Public Works design manual standards and guidelines that we bring to you every single year, that's on the agenda, I believe, for the 12th of November. So if you want us to bring the stormwater manual on the same date as we do the standards, it may make some sense to do it that way. So we could coincide those.
Just wondering if there are any projects in the pipeline that might be affected by this.
Nope. Qualtrics hasn't applied, but they've been in talk to us.
Correct, and with Qualtrics being commercial, I mean, if you're talking the 200-foot setback, they can't do anything within 100 feet of the river already, and with it being commercial, they would just be required to waterproof anything. I don't see it negatively impacting anything that's in the pipeline.
And I believe they're high enough above to where they should, building at the grade that they've got right now, I think they're already a foot above the floodplain. So I wouldn't, I mean, we would implement that, but I don't think that changes anything for them.
I think we can look forward to, I think coming on the 12th would be all right. We'll see what other meetings we have. George,
I don't think we need to bring it back.
not to work meeting, right? So I can spring council.
So we need a motion to bring it to work meeting on the 12th? Or just let leadership chair. Okay.
Thank you, Rob. Our next item is an ordinance to amend the Provo City Code to identify zones where cannabis production is permitted. Brandon Marshall. Got some presentation.
It's good to be here with you today. I'm new to the city, and thank you for letting me here today. So the Development Services Office has been dealing a little bit with the issue of medical cannabis. We've had a few requests like, hey, where can we locate dispensaries or production facilities? And we looked into it a little bit and became more aware of some of the changes that have occurred in the state code. You're well aware of the discussions and actions that have occurred before the state legislature. In fact, some of the changes that occurred due to the special legislative session of 2019 actually just went into effect about a month ago. And so, talk a little bit about that. So one of the things that the state legislature did is they adopted a definition for cannabis production establishment. It basically encapsulates, it considers cultivation, production, and laboratory facilities. And so notice it doesn't deal with dispensaries, and I'm not going to discuss dispensaries at all. This proposal doesn't deal with dispensaries or pharmacies at all. But what this proposal does is it basically would have the city, if it's adopted, would have the city establish the state's definition of cannabis production establishment. The city, or the state, with section 441A 406 says that the city has to allow a cannabis production facility in every agricultural and every industrial zone unless the city takes, a municipality or city takes action to designate at least one agricultural zone and at least one industrial zone. And so that's what we're proposing with this. It's fairly simple. We're proposing that the city adopt this definition and then establish one agricultural zone and one industrial zone for cannabis production establishments. And the agricultural zone that we propose for that type of activity would be the A110 zone. And so this is a fairly simple amendment. It's just basically adding a line item to say that cannabis production establishments would be allowed in the A110 zone. The reason why we chose the A110 zone is staff thought that it might be wise for the city to kind of take a measured approach on this item with the relative newness of the laws and its use, legal use in the state and city. We thought let's start it out in a measured approach. The A110 zone contains the least amount of land for an agricultural zone in the city, 480 acres. If you want to compare it with another zone like the A15 zone, that's a 5-acre parcel minimum in the A15 zone. You have over 3,200 acres of land, and so we thought let's start small. So the rest of the industrial and agricultural zones, this use is prohibited. So that's what all of these slides are basically showing, that cannabis production is not permitted in say the M1 zone. But then you come to the freeway industrial zone that already allows uses such as it allows for drugs. That's a pretty broad term, but it does allow for the manufacturing of things like codeine and painkillers, things like that. So I thought that the freeway industrial zone was a good zone to allow a cannabis production establishment, which again could include cultivation, manufacturing, and laboratory facilities. Again, this is just showing that the M2 zone would allow that, and same with the PIC zone. You can see on this map where the A110 zone is and the freeway industrial. The A110 zone is by and large down by the airport, just north and east. The freeway industrial zone runs along I-15 on the very north end of the city. There is a small piece of A110 that's actually owned by the city, by Slate Canyons, 5 acres. So staff thinks, again, this is a good way to get started with addressing and administering this use. Start with a measured, kind of smaller approach, and then as I would assume that in the future we'll see people propose this use in other zones, and then we can address those proposals as they come into the city. So that's what I have for you, and I'm here to answer any questions you have.
I've got a question for Brian.
Yes, sir.
Federal law prohibits this. State law allows it. Who identifies who? Do they identify the city against the federal government?
Well, after the article came out about the county's decision on that, we did some research. We can't figure out any liability that we would have to the federal government for. The fact of the matter is, if we don't act, it's allowed everywhere. Okay, because the state has mandated that it be allowed.
Okay, so this is the best.
This is actually limiting it, because what the state code says is if we don't say that it's only allowed in certain agricultural and manufacturing zones, it's allowed in all agricultural and manufacturing zones.
Thank you, sir.
Might I add one point? The city is zoned such that 50% of the city is covered in either industrial or agricultural zones. So this use would be allowed in 50% of the city unless the city takes some type of action.
Any other questions? And this will be on the meeting tonight.
I mean, the A110 out there, I'm just thinking in terms of that. I mean, there's really nothing out there, is there? I mean, for development. Isn't that?
McCord's greenhouses.
McCord's greenhouses.
And a few houses. I guess I don't know that.
Okay. That's not the area. I mean, I feel like that's the zone where the water table is so high it's not even developable. Is that not? Am I not remembering that correctly?
It is a
high water table.
I mean, I guess my question is, are we essentially sort of squeezing it out altogether? They're making it so hard that...
No, because you don't need an occupied dwelling to grow a crop. So the fact that it's in a floodplain doesn't affect the crop.
It's also assumed a lot of this would take place in greenhouses because of the year-round growth control.
I guess maybe I needed to go back to the first definition. I thought we were talking about potential developments as well as fields, right? We weren't just talking about cultivation facility, processing facility, or a lab, right?
Yeah, those are not occupied buildings; they're not dwellings, so you could build those in a floodplain.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, and we'll see you tonight.
Thank you.
Item 15 is an ordinance amending the Provo City Code to clarify development, landscaping requirements, and allow for zero-scape citywide application. And Mr. Chapman Weaver will present it to us.
Thank you. So this came up as staff worked with some citizens and realized that we could work on some clarifications to our landscaping text and adding the additional sections of xeriscaping and synthetic astroturf. So staff looked through our landscaping text and saw some definitions could be added to add additional clarification to help us and also the public. Definitions that we're adding to the landscaping text would be artificial turf grass, a little bit revisions on ground cover, hardscape being reworked, and adding the definition of impervious landscaped area. Also, we revised the definition of landscaping, ornamental grass, permeable, softscape, turf grass, xeric landscaping, and zero-scaping.
The traditional term of xeriscaping is a trademark term, and we can't use that in our definitions, so xeric landscaping suffices that. Staff also saw fit that to add the definition of xeriscaping to differentiate between the two, because we do not want xeriscaping in our city. It's not the best looking. Additionally, as we went through the text, we wanted to add the design standard of having no more than 50% of the rear yard, front, and combined side yards can be impervious. This also came from the old definition of hardscape that said part of that could be recreational facilities, which you could interpret that having a basketball court. So I don't think we wanted a basketball court to be your entire yard. So this is maintaining part of your yard has to be permeable, however you see fit for that. Additionally, this is the whole section on xeric landscaping. Staff, the definition of 35% came from discussing this with different staff members with Provo City and the Sustainability Committee to come up with that amount. So what that is saying is that you can xeric landscape, but we still want you to have 35% plant coverage within 3 years of plant maturity. We don't want a giant rock garden because we are concerned about the urban heat island effect with that. And this gives some clarification for what you would need to do as a homeowner if you are to install artificial turf grass as well in your yard. Staff toured a couple of facilities, looked at different grasses to see what worked for them, what hasn't, and try to give some framework on this to help the homeowners and us as well. Additionally, staff worked with our zoning administrator to really help code enforcement and also the public to know what's required of them when they do get a zone violation complaint for their yard. This is really to help them give some more framework on both ends of the parties. Additionally, I went through the section to change the title from community development to the new departments as we went through this section, so that will be accurate. Additionally, the text for front yards specifically said front yards should be landscape, but if the homeowner doesn't develop or doesn't use the entire buildable area for a lot, they could theoretically not have to landscape that part, so we wanted to clarify that, clean that up in the text. This is just coinciding with 1520, so things are aligned. Additionally, there are some examples of illustrations in 1406. Staff added a couple additional illustrations to give some another way to show the public what's considered your front yard, side yard, rear yards within different street formats here and here. Just to add some clarification on that. This is what we don't want. You don't want your head to walk into a tree. I don't want that. Additionally, there's a couple good examples of some xeric landscaping within the city. Are there any questions?
I don't see any. This will be in tonight's meeting also?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Item 16 is an ordinance amending the zone map classification of approximately 11.87 acres of real property generally located at 1400 South State Street from residential R110 to medium density of residential NDR in the Spring Creek neighborhood. And here, Ardmore is here to present.
Yes, thank you. So this is down in Spring Creek where, if you recall, members of this council in 2017 changed the zoning from manufacturing to R1 in the expectation that this area would develop as a medium density residential area. So you can see there between 1320 South and about 1512 South, these are the properties that are proposed in this development. The general plan is mixed use. The Southeast Neighborhood Plan has designated this area for medium density residential. Current zone is R110, like I say, which was kind of a measure so the council could see the developments that come through this area. The site plan shows, I believe, 13 four-story structures with central staircases, 4 units per floor. They're parked. They meet conceptually. They meet all the requirements of the MDR zone. This
has neighborhood support. This was received favorably by the neighborhood at their meeting. Like I say, it meets the general plan, the Southeast Neighborhood Plan for the area. I believe this is on your agenda for tonight. If you had any questions that I could prepare for, I could take those.
Any questions for Aaron? Guess not. We'll see you tonight.
All right, thanks.
Discussion regarding a pro-zone rezone and accompanying ordinance text amendment for 1 acre of property generally located at 35 North, 500 West in the Dixon neighborhood. Brian Maxfield, what's it about?
This project, if you're familiar with Dr. McLean's office building, is off of 500 West and 400 North on that, would be the northeast corner of the block. Currently, there's a duplex that was built in, I believe, 1944, somewhere in there, 42. And then the medical office, where he has his practice, which was built in 1996. There are 5 residential units actually under that were approved along with that site. And then there's a, oh, I'm controlling this, aren't I? I apologize. Okay, and then the other is existing 6-unit apartment building built in 1999. The approvals of that time looked at joint uses. The Planning Commission felt that there was a problem with that they weren't really distinctive enough. There was an appeal to the Board of Adjustment. Board of Adjustment overturned Planning Commission and did find there was reason to share parking between the uses. This proposed building would be located directly west, and the idea would be to continue to share spaces. One of the advantages of this site over others is we've had 20 years to look at it and see if it worked. It works. I've gone by there several times in the evening, different times, and I've never seen a problem with the parking in that area. The allowances in this pro zone would allow that overlap, and I think, as you'll see, it basically parks the apartment buildings, the residential buildings as they're needed, and then the overlap is just the 18 spaces that could be used within those that requirement for the medical office. The pro zone also restricts some of the uses that could occur in that medical office building were it to be sold and reused for another purpose. So it limits, someone that could come in and have a heavy parking requirement. Staff feels that this is a way to recognize the existing uses, allow a decent infill project, one that looks very nice and this neighborhood has been accepted, and continue on in this use in a good location that's not going to impact other areas of the neighborhood. Questions?
I know that we've been looking to try to move away from a lot of pro zones, and it's been pretty tough to do. I really like the buildings. They keep them up. They're very nice, and I think the neighborhood supports those buildings. I guess this isn't something that someone could take necessarily and move to a different part of the community. Is this specific pro zone specific enough to this particular parcel that we won't be saying, well, you let them do it, why won't you let me do it?
All the pro zones are written with the idea they could be used in other places, but they're also very particular to sites. It makes it very difficult to do that. One of the reasons we had to go to pro zone because we don't have a mixed use zone. I think that's been one of our desires, to eventually develop a mixed use zone that would have allowed this type of these two uses together. I think that's still the best solution, is really to create a zone instead of keep adding to the pro zones. And so in this case, the pro zone is particular to this site, but conceivably somebody could find a site where they could add a medical office building and some other residential. Yes. I can't think where that would be, but someone could be creative and do that.
And the reason we're doing this is to allow for the parking issue so that other building can come in.
Correct. Yeah, they do have 19 units. We kept it under 20 because when you have 20 units in an MDR zone, then you have to put in amenity spaces. This one was limited because of the way it was already developed. They are looking at taking out some grass that's there behind the duplex, so it does move things around a little bit. But you're also across the street from an elementary school that has quite a large playfield area. You're a block away from North Park. And so, you know, there are amenities in the area that would suffice for any, I think, residential uses. But the key was to keep it under 20 units, because once we get into that MDR, then you would have that comparison that I think you're talking about.
So the two things that we are looking at is with Pro Zone, we'll keep it, we'll have less parking, and we'll have less green space with this particular Pro Zone.
Well, it meets the requirement for green space for something that size.
Does it
And
meet
yes.
It still meets the requirement for green space, okay.
Right, if they jump to 20 units, that kicks into a different requirement.
Okay.
That's
So
why they're
we're okay
at
on
20.
green space, basically.
Right.
Good.
Council Chair Harding did have comments. He says, this subject property is on my block. The applicant has done a great job over the years managing and maintaining the apartments that are already on the property. This gives me greater confidence that even with the requested densification, this property will be of net benefit to the area. There always is a fear that the property will change hands and may not always be so well managed. I support the proposal, but don't consider it a routine request. And I think that it should receive a second hearing to allow the neighbors the full chance to review the final proposal. So Brian, is that, since I read it?
I mean, it sounds like that's an official request.
I'll make it if he does.
I was going to say, you could get into an argument about whether he's really present at the meeting or not to make the request, but I think unless the council really doesn't want to, that the courteous thing to do would be to just go ahead and delay it.
Councilmember Stewart has requested anyway.
Just for your information, you know that Dave does live, it is literally his block. He's right there in that corner. So and will the neighborhood chair be here tonight to discuss this?
I'm not sure, I haven't been able to contact him lately. There were two neighborhood meetings on this originally, and in speaking to him initially, he had no problems with it. There's kind of a semi-line of demarcation that's kind of half block area because of the orientation to 500 West. And the old neighborhood chair, her problems were really once it went west of that area is where she had problems. The new neighborhood chair, my recollection, I don't have it in quote, I apologize, but he was very supportive of the idea. In fact, originally he's the one that said keep the duplex because it gave a street presence that fit into the neighborhood better than if you move the apartment building on to 400 North. The original request, the applicant was actually looking at tearing down the duplex and putting this building on there. But the neighborhood chair felt they'd rather keep the duplex, move the building back behind that so that the street presence would be reflected by that smaller residential building.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian, and we'll have this in our meeting tonight, but we will not vote tonight. If I call for a vote, we'll sort of remind you. A closed session has been requested, so Mr. Jones, if you'll.
Yes, I believe there are two items to be discussed, one of which involves potential acquisition of property, and the other involves potential sale of property that has been publicly disclosed as available for sale. And so both of those are appropriate for closed session.
Okay, I'll look for a motion then to close this meeting, close our council meeting, and move to a closed session. Okay, Connect made a motion, George Hanlon second. All in favor? It's unanimous with exception, excuse David Sewell and David Harding. So we'll go ahead and move to that, in the other room for a closed session.